The first thing I learned about America's national parks is that silence isn't the same thing as peace. Sometimes silence is an animal watching you breathe. Sometimes it's a canyon holding its breath. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, it's something else entirely, something that doesn't belong to land or wind or time. My name is Evan Rourke. I'm 36 years old, born and raised in a small town outside Missoula, Montana. I've spent more nights in my RV than in any apartment I've ever rented, and I've crossed almost every major national park in the United States at least once. I used to believe I understood the rhythm of these places, the honest calls of wildlife, the sudden temperature drops, the way fog curls over the earth like it's remembering something ancient. But that belief changed the night I found myself alone on the far edge of Joshua Tree National Park, parked between two monoliths that looked like frozen waves of stone. The sun had dipped just minutes before, leaving behind that eerie orange bruise on the horizon that always makes the world feel like it's ending quietly. I pulled my camp chair out, brewed a cup of coffee, and let the desert wind skim across my face. Back then, I thought the only thing I feared was running out of propane or losing signal. I didn't think places could watch you, or worse, judge you. My weird experiences didn't begin as shouts or knocks or phantom footsteps. No, they started the way real fear does, as small, subtle distortions you almost talk yourself out of. I noticed it first in the sound of the wind. Joshua Tree is known for its strange acoustics, but that night the air wasn't moving normally. It wasn't passing over me, it was circling me, looping like it was learning my shape. I tried to brush it off. Long road trip, not enough sleep, too much caffeine, that's what I told myself. But unease doesn't care about logic. It just waits. By the time the stars came out, those brutal, sharp desert stars that look more like holes punched through the night sky, the sense of being observed had rooted itself deep. I wasn't panicking, not yet. But my awareness sharpened. My breathing grew shallow. My instincts whispered something I didn't want to hear. Pack up. Leave now. But instinct is easy to ignore when you've spent years telling yourself you're tough, experienced, unshakable, and I'd come here for quiet, for that strange healing you find only where the world is still wild. So I stayed. Around midnight, the temperature collapsed. 1 minute warm, the next freezing. Not cooling, collapsing. My breath fogged instantly. The air tasted metallic, like touching your tongue to a cold battery. I zipped my jacket higher and stepped outside with my flashlight. The silence had shifted. It was no longer empty. It was listening. You know that sensation? When the world feels like it's waiting for you to make the next move? When even your footsteps sound wrong, like they're being swallowed too fast? Every instinct in me tensed in a way I hadn't experienced since I was a kid lost in the woods behind my parents' house. I scanned the terrain, the boulders, the small scrub plants, the outlines of Joshua trees reaching up like broken silhouettes. Nothing moved. No insects, no wind, not even the distant rustle of a night owl. I stepped around the side of my RV and froze. There were tracks in the dust, not animal tracks, not boot prints. They were too long, too narrow, and spaced unevenly, as if whatever made them didn't fully commit to touching the ground, like something learning how to walk. My throat tightened. I felt my pulse spike behind my ears. I crouched, shining my light over the prints. They zigzagged, almost childlike, but with a hesitance that made the skin on my arms prickle. I followed them with the beam of my flashlight, tracing their pattern as they led farther away from camp. Then my light reached the end of the trail and landed on another set of prints. My own, perfectly aligned, perfectly mirrored. But I hadn't walked out that way. I stood slowly, looking back toward my RV. The prints stretched between me and the door as if I had walked that route 5 minutes ago. But I hadn't. I'd only stepped out once on the opposite side. Quiet unease snapped into suspicion. And suspicion, that's when the real fear begins. Because that's when you stop pretending you're imagining things and start accepting that something is wrong. I backed toward my RV, careful, slow, my breath a sharp hiss between my teeth. I didn't turn my back. Instinct told me not to. And it wasn't long before I understood why. Something shifted between the rocks. Not movement, not in the normal sense. It was like a shape losing its balance with reality for a split second. A shimmer, a wrongness, a vertical stretch of darkness that shouldn't have been there. I blinked hard. It blinked back. I didn't see eyes, but something in that vertical dark pulsed like it became aware of my awareness. And the moment that happened, the dread hit me, hot and cold at the same time, like being dropped into icy water and held under. I stumbled backward onto the RV steps, slamming the door behind me. The air inside felt safer, but only barely. My hands were shaking as I locked the deadbolt. My breath fogged the window. I wiped it instinctively, and that was a mistake. My reflection stared back at me, but the world outside the glass was wrong. The boulders looked stretched, like they'd been tugged upward by invisible strings. The Joshua trees looked sharper, their branches angled toward the RV. But worst of all, scattered in the dust outside, I saw not one but 3 sets of prints now. One set, mine. One set, the strange ones. And between them, a third set. Larger, deeper, leading toward my door. When dread settles into the spine, you don't just feel fear, you feel prediction. You feel what's coming before it arrives. And deep inside me, something began to whisper a truth I wasn't ready to accept. This wasn't my first encounter. Maybe not here. Maybe not in this form. But the wilderness had been watching me longer than I knew. I tried to steady my breathing. Told myself I'd seen weird things before. Told myself parks are full of illusions, temperature inversions, mirages, animal tracks that deform in the dust. But as I stood inside the RV looking out, that rational voice felt like a cheap hotel speaker playing music in the hallway. Background noise. Something to ignore. Something dragged itself across the side of my RV. Not a claw, not a branch, a hand. I heard the drag, slow, deliberate, almost testing the metal. And then, before I could react, something tapped on the window beside my bed. 1 tap, 2, 3, each one softer than the last, like it was learning pressure, learning me. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might bruise my ribs from the inside. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Even the air around me felt trapped, suspended, like the whole world had crawled inside a glass jar. Then, silence again. Heavy. Listening. Waiting. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if the stories, the rumors, the so-called hauntings tied to national parks weren't just legends born from fear, but warnings. Warnings we'd stopped listening to. Warnings meant for people exactly like me. That was the night fear stopped being a visitor and became a companion. I barely slept that night in Joshua Tree. I kept the lights low, sitting with my back against the wall, feeling every vibration in the metal frame of my RV, every whisper of wind that might have been wind, every tap that might have been settling metal or, maybe, fingers. When dawn finally cracked open the darkness, I stepped outside, half expecting to see something standing there, waiting. But the prints had already begun to fade. The desert wind had scraped away most of the strange ones, smoothing them into the dirt like they'd never existed at all. But the deeper set, the third set, was still there. Clear. Heavy. Leading straight to my door. That was the first moment I truly understood something I'd later hear from rangers across the country. The wilderness doesn't hide its warnings. It hides our memory of them. I left Joshua Tree that morning feeling like I'd survived something I couldn't name. I thought distance would help, that the next park would clear my head. But fear has a way of following you, quietly, patiently, like a hitchhiker you don't remember picking up. Weeks later, I found myself in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It was a place I'd always found comforting. Misty hills, thick old-growth trees, the scent of wet leaves and earth that reminded me of childhood. But comfort can be deceptive. Sometimes it lures you in, loosens your guard, waits until you're breathing easy before it shifts. At least that's how it happened to me. I'd parked near a quiet, less trafficked part of the woods, a place locals called Old Widow's Hollow, though no map listed that name. I didn't ask why. Campers learn not to ask sometimes. Too many stories begin with a local shrugging and saying, well, things happen out there. The first night was normal, cool, peaceful, even healing. I hiked a bit, Cooked dinner, let the night sounds roll through me. Crickets, owls, distant trickle of a creek. It was the kind of night that makes you believe in the good parts of wandering. But the second night? The second night rewrote something inside me. It started with the fog, thicker than usual, rolling in early. I sat by the fire, watching it coil between the trees like pale fingers. Fog in the Smokies isn't unusual, but this fog felt alive, purposeful. It gathered not everywhere, but in a ring around my campsite, like it was circling me. I kept glancing into it, half expecting to see shapes, eyes, movement. But each time I looked, the fog only thickened, as if refusing to be transparent. My nerves rose like a tide. Not panic yet, but tension, a building pressure behind my ribs. I went inside the RV, telling myself I was being dramatic. Weather does weird things here. Cold pockets, sudden moisture spikes, perfectly rational. But rationality has a brittle edge that fear can snap without effort. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I still struggle to describe. It wasn't knocking, it wasn't footsteps, it was a voice. Thin, fluttering, like wind dragging a single word across leaves. My name, not shouted, not whispered, just spoken. Evan. The sound drifted around the RV, circling, repeating the syllables like the forest was learning how to shape my name. Instinct told me not to respond, not to move, not even to breathe too loud. I stayed frozen, staring at the ceiling, my skin crawling, but something inside me, a darker curiosity, pulled me toward the window. So I looked. At first, all I saw was fog, but then a shape materialized inside it. Tall, thin, slouched, like a man who'd been bent in half long ago and had never straightened back out. I couldn't see its face, but I could see its arms. They hung too long, swaying slightly, like the fog itself breathed through them. The figure tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, like its bones were remembering how joints were supposed to work. Evan. Hearing my name from outside my RV, alone in the woods, surrounded by fog that muffled everything except that voice, did something to me I wasn't ready for. It cracked open the part of my fear I'd been keeping tightly locked. Suspicion became dread. I backed away from the window, careful to stay low. My heart felt too big for my chest. Every inhale scraped like it was too loud. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal, not even a flicker. The entire world outside felt sealed off from anything human. Then came the tapping, not on the door this time, on the metal roof, slow, measured, like fingertips testing the distance between us. I stood there staring upward, feeling each tap vibrate through the frame. The fog shape moved closer, its outline clearer now against the faint glow of the moon. I could see ribs, long ribs, too many ribs, pressing through its torso as it shifted. My body screamed at me to run, to drive, to get out of that hollow and never look back. But another part of me, a part I didn't like, wanted to understand what I was seeing. Not out of bravery, out of denial. Because admitting something impossible was happening meant rewriting everything I believed about these lands. The tapping stopped. The figure stopped. The fog stopped moving. And then another voice whispered from the opposite side of the RV. But it wasn't my name this time. It was laughter. Quiet, broken, familiar. My mother's laughter. She'd passed away years ago. Hearing that sound, the exact cadence, the soft, breathy chuckle she used when she didn't want to encourage my bad jokes, hit me harder than fear. It hit something emotional, vulnerable, raw. For a split second, I stepped toward the door. And the second I did, something scraped hard down the length of my RV as if warning me, punishing me for reacting. That jolt snapped me back. I locked every latch, pulled the curtains, sat on the floor with my back against the cabinet, trying to breathe through the panic building in my chest. Outside, the laughter twisted into something else, warped, bent backward, like someone trying to mimic a sound they'd only ever heard once. The figure in the fog moved closer still, its limbs jerking in odd angles now, like it was excited, like it sensed the shift in my fear. I felt trapped, boxed in, like the RV had turned from shelter to cage. Then, just when it felt like the world was collapsing inward, everything stopped at once. No tapping, no voice, no fog movement. Silence returned, but not the peaceful kind, not the kind that means the night is settling. This silence was loaded, charged, the kind that comes right before something breaks. And then came the final sound. A single, hollow knock from the back door of the RV. Not the main side door, the back utility door I almost never used. A door you couldn't access easily unless you knew exactly where it was, unless you'd been watching long enough to learn my habits. My breath shook. My hands went cold. Panic surged up in me like a tide swallowing a shoreline. I didn't move. Couldn't move. The knock didn't repeat. It didn't need to, because when I looked down, I realized something that froze every vein in my body. My keys, the keys I always leave on the hook by the door, were gone. I didn't hear them move. I didn't see them taken. I don't know how long they'd been missing, but I knew with bone-deep certainty that they had been taken from inside the RV, not outside, not through a window. Someone or something had been inside long before the fog came. And the only thought that cut through my terror was this: if it took my keys, what else of mine did it take? The night felt like it held its breath with me, waiting for what would happen next. I didn't sleep after realizing the keys were gone. I sat awake until dawn, gripping a kitchen knife I knew wouldn't matter if something truly wanted in. Every noise outside became a threat. Every shift in the fog felt like a presence pressing its face against the thin walls of my RV. When the sun finally pushed through the trees and burned the mist away, it felt like being released from a clenched fist. I found the keys 30 feet away, hanging neatly from a branch, swaying gently in the morning breeze. That was the moment I understood the truth I'd been refusing to accept since Joshua Tree. Whatever I'd disturbed, whatever had taken interest in me, it wasn't tied to a single place. It wasn't just a desert thing, not just a Smoky Mountain thing. It was something older, something watching me across distances that didn't matter. I took the keys, drove until the road blurred beneath me, and didn't stop until I reached the edge of Yellowstone National Park. I shouldn't have gone in. I knew that the moment I passed the ranger station. Yellowstone has always felt different, bigger, heavier, like its silence carries centuries of secrets that don't concern us. But I was tired. I was looking for normal, hoping distance would break whatever followed me. I parked near a lesser-known thermal area where the ground trembles beneath your boots and the air constantly smells like sulfur and minerals. Even with other campers nearby, I felt strangely alone, like the land itself pushed people apart so it could listen better. The first evening passed almost peacefully. I walked a loop trail, watched steam rise from the hot springs like ghosts waking up from shallow graves. For a few hours, I let myself believe the fear belonged to the past. Then night fell, and the ground began to breathe. Yellowstone's earth always feels alive, but that night the breathing felt synchronized. Deep inhales beneath my feet, followed by a low exhale through the fumaroles. Rhythmic, intentional. Like the land wasn't releasing pressure, but communicating. I tried to shake the feeling off. I made dinner, played a podcast, read a few pages of a book, but when I finally lay down in bed and turned off the lights, the breathing didn't stop. It got louder, closer, and for a moment I wasn't sure it was the earth at all. I turned onto my side, staring into the dark interior of my RV, letting my eyes adjust. There was no fog this time, no tapping on the window, no voice calling my name, but something else happened, something worse because of how subtle it was. I heard footsteps, not outside on dirt, inside, soft, careful, like bare feet walking on the vinyl floor. I froze. My heartbeat hammered in my ears. I slid my hand under the blanket and wrapped my fingers around my phone, not to call for help because I already knew there wouldn't be service, but to use as a light. But I didn't turn it on because the footsteps stopped right behind me. I could feel the weight in the air shift, like someone or something stood inches from the back of my neck, watching, waiting. I didn't breathe, didn't swallow, didn't even blink. Every muscle locked so tightly it hurt. Then the footsteps moved again, slow and deliberate, circling me. Whatever it was didn't walk like a person, too smooth, too balanced, almost gliding despite the sound of each step. It paused near the small table, near the sink, near the door. Then, finally, near the foot of my bed. I forced myself to turn on the screen of my phone, letting the dim light reveal the space around me. There was nothing there but the smell that hit me instantly. Damp earth, wet stone, the scent you get when you open a cave sealed for centuries. I sat up, scanning the RV again, my breath tight in my chest. The air felt colder than it should have. Heavier, like whoever or whatever had been inside hadn't left so much as stepped out of sight. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, desperate for fresh air, even if it meant facing the darkness. The night sky over Yellowstone was clear, the stars sharp as knives. Steam drifted from the thermal vents in thin ribbons twisting in the wind. Everything seemed still until I heard it. A low, almost human exhale coming from behind a ridge of rocks where a thermal pool bubbled slowly. I approached, cautious, flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam cut through the steam and landed on footprints. Human footprints, but not mine. Bare, deep, leading directly toward the boiling pool. Too close. Far too close. I followed them with the light, squinting through the steam. The prints stopped abruptly at the edge of the pool, but there was no sign of someone slipping in, no splash mark, no dragged dirt, just disappearance. Like the person stepped forward and dissolved. The steam thickened suddenly, billowing toward me like a wave pushing me back. The exhale came again, longer this time, almost frustrated. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure through the haze. Tall, thin, crooked, like the one from the Smokies, but stretched differently, as if molded by the heat of the earth instead of fog. My instincts surged into panic. I backed away fast, stumbling over a rock. The steam followed, chasing me like a living thing, curling around my ankles. I sprinted back to my RV, heart beating so violently I tasted copper. Once inside, I locked the door, pulled the blinds, turned on every light. But the lights did nothing to ease the fear because something on the table caught my eye. A small basalt stone. I hadn't brought it in. I hadn't picked it up. I hadn't touched any rocks at all. But there it sat, wet, warm, like it had been just pulled from deep underground. My hands shook as I picked it up. The surface felt wrong, not rough or porous like basalt should. It felt smooth, too smooth, like something had worn it down through countless years of handling or holding or passing between hands that weren't human. I set it down fast, every nerve screaming that I just made a mistake. And that's when the ground beneath the RV shuddered. Not an earthquake. I'd felt those before in Montana. This was a push, a single deliberate jolt, like something underneath the ground had hit the earth from below. Hard. I crouched near the floor, gripping the counter to steady myself, listening as the breathing resumed, deep, slow, but unmistakably aware. That was when I made the connection I'd been avoiding since Joshua Tree. It wasn't fog, it wasn't shape, it wasn't just footsteps or laughter or vanishing keys. It was attention. The wilderness wasn't haunted by random things. Something was watching me from park to park, tracking me, learning me, testing the walls of my life, my routine, my RV, my denial. And Yellowstone. Yellowstone wasn't the next place it found me. It was the first place it finally decided to speak in its own voice. The deep exhale turned into a rumble, a human-like hum, a vibration that traveled up through the floor, through my bones, and into my skull until I felt sick. And then layered underneath that vibration came something else. A whisper, not outside, not in the thermal pool, not through the vents or the earth, inside my head. "Evan, why did you leave the hollow?" I froze. The knife of cold horror sank straight through my spine, because that meant it hadn't just followed me physically. It had followed my memory, my fear, my name. The lights inside the RV flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. I stood in the pitch dark, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to think of anything except the sickening truth blooming inside me. National parks weren't just places where people experienced strange things. They were places where strange things remembered. And one of them had remembered me. When the lights died in Yellowstone, the darkness swallowed everything so completely it felt physical, like stepping into the mouth of something vast and patient. I stayed absolutely still. The RV's metal frame ticked softly as it cooled, but beneath that quiet came a deeper sound. The low, rhythmic thump of the earth breathing in and out, syncing with my pulse until I couldn't tell which belonged to me. The whisper didn't return, but its absence felt worse. Silence can wound you in ways noise never could. Silence lets your mind finish the sentence. The darkness started. I reached for my phone, but the battery had drained to nothing. None of the lights responded. The entire RV felt stripped bare, like the moment a house goes cold after the heater shuts off midwinter. I forced myself to move, inching toward the drawer where I kept a small backup flashlight. Every step felt like wading through invisible water. When I finally clicked the light on, the beam cut a thin line through the black. My breath trembled. I scanned the RV. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Nothing shifted. But something had changed. The basalt stone was gone. I stepped back, every instinct screaming in quiet panic. The stone had been sitting right there on the table. I hadn't touched it since. I hadn't even looked away long enough for something to move it. But it wasn't there anymore. Not on the table, not on the floor, not anywhere within the beam of my light. I checked the door, still locked. I checked the windows, unbroken, and yet the stone was gone like it had never existed at all. That small fact hit me harder than anything else, because it meant I wasn't dealing with something moving through objects or spaces. I was dealing with something moving through moments. Whatever watched me wasn't limited by distance or doors or locks. It stepped between seconds like I stepped between rooms. The flashlight flickered, just once, but enough to punch fear into my throat. I clutched it tighter and whispered to myself, low, steady, the way you talk to something scared inside your own chest. Move. Now. Move. I packed nothing. There was no time to gather the gear, no time to secure anything inside. I shoved the keys into the ignition and prayed the engine wouldn't do what everything else had done, die. It roared to life on the first turn. Relief hit me like a blow. But as I pulled away from the campsite, the ground beneath the RV rippled. The way asphalt ripples in a heat mirage, but this was earth. Real earth, quivering like something alive shifted just below the surface. I hit the gas. The road twisted ahead between steaming vents and shadowed pines. The night outside was thick as ink, and the steam rising from the thermal ground billowed across the asphalt like it was chasing me. Through the rearview mirror, the fog from earlier, thicker now, darker, pulled itself along the ground behind me, rolling low and fast like a predator trying not to be seen. Every instinct screamed at me to drive faster, but fear can make you clumsy. It can make you reckless. And Yellowstone's roads don't forgive either. I forced myself to breathe, to stay steady, to resist the urge to glance back again and again, even though I could feel something stretching thin behind me, like a shadow being dragged by its own hunger. By the time I reached the park boundary, the fog had thinned, giving me one final glimpse of something tall and slouched standing just beyond the thermal vents, its outline bending the steam around it. Watching. Always watching. I didn't stop driving until I crossed into Montana, then into Idaho, then into Oregon, chasing distance as though distance meant safety. But fear doesn't work that way. What follows you in the night doesn't stop at state lines. What remembers you doesn't forget. And whatever followed me from Joshua Tree to the Smokies to Yellowstone, it didn't disappear. It settled into the quiet places of my mind, waiting for moments I let myself relax. It took weeks before I realized what had been wrong since that night. It wasn't just the memory of the stone. It wasn't the whispers. It wasn't the tracks or the fog or the breathing earth. It was me. Something in me wasn't the same. Something was missing. Not large, not obvious, not something anyone else would notice. But I noticed. One morning, long after I'd left the parks behind, I reached for my jacket pocket and found a torn scrap of paper. I didn't recognize it. The handwriting wasn't mine. The letters were long slashes, almost symbols, shapes that felt as wrong as the unknown tracks I'd seen outside my RV in Joshua Tree. But the thing that froze me wasn't the writing. It was the message. You shouldn't have left so soon. You weren't done listening. I dropped the paper like it burned. I didn't remember picking it up, didn't remember writing anything, didn't remember any moment when something could have slipped it into my pocket, but I felt the echo of the message inside my chest, like the words were carved into the walls of my ribs instead of written on paper. Something had followed me inside myself, and yet, as terrifying as that truth was, another truth began to form. Quiet, strange, steady. Fear is not just a warning. Fear is a teacher. Fear is the wilderness demanding you pay attention. I'd spent years camping across America thinking I understood its beauty, its silence, its vastness. I thought the dangers were external. Animals, weather, getting lost. But the real danger was thinking the wild didn't see me back. The wild always sees us, and sometimes it calls us by name. I don't camp the same way anymore. I don't choose sites just because they're quiet. I don't ignore my instincts. I don't dismiss strange sounds or shifting winds or that prickle on the back of my neck that tells me the night is listening. I respect the places that feel old and aware. I acknowledge the moments when the world pauses to watch. I pay attention to the small signs, the way air stills, the way shadows lengthen, the way silence suddenly feels heavy instead of calm. Because the wilderness isn't evil, but it is alive, and sometimes it wants to be heard. The last time I drove through a national park, months after Yellowstone, I pulled off at a small overlook in the Grand Tetons. The mountains towered in the distance, sharp and blue in the morning light. The wind brushed against my skin in a familiar way, neither threatening nor gentle, just aware. And for the first time, I didn't try to ignore the feeling. I stood there, breathing in the cold air, and whispered into the stillness, soft but honest, "I'm listening." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single gust of wind pressed against me, firm, deliberate, like a hand between my shoulder blades, reminding me that fear isn't the end of the story. Fear is the beginning of understanding. Fear is the proof that you're still alive. Fear is the wilderness asking you to look deeper, at yourself, at the world, at the things we can't explain but can't deny. And the truth is, I don't know if whatever followed me is finished. I don't know if it ever will be. But I've learned something I carry with me everywhere I go. The world is bigger than us, older than us, smarter than we give it credit for. And when something out there calls your name in the dark, you can run, you can hide, you can deny it, but you can also listen. Not because you want to, because you need to. Because the wilderness isn't haunted by the unknown, it's haunted by the forgotten, and sometimes those forgotten things remember you. I never understood how a place could feel both abandoned and watched at the same time. Until the night I drove my old Volkswagen Westfalia into a forgotten RV town called Ridgetop Springs, an off-highway relic tucked somewhere between Nevada's dust and California's silence, a place that no longer appeared in any campground directory, but still somehow remained on the green highway sign like a promise that hadn't yet been removed. I hadn't planned to camp there. I hadn't planned to stop at all. But the sun was collapsing behind the ridge, and the desert wind had begun to shove at the van in that sideways, insistent way that makes you feel as if the whole road is trying to erase you one lane at a time. I had been driving for 12 hours, my head thick, my eyes burning, and every campground marked on my map was full. Ridgetop Springs sounded like a joke, a myth, something locals whispered about but never directed travelers toward. But I didn't have the luxury of 3 more hours on the highway. When I pulled off the exit, the air grew immediately heavier. The kind of heaviness that doesn't come from temperature but from memory, as if the land itself didn't want to be disturbed again. My name is Avery. I'm 34, born on the Oregon coast where fog feels like a second language. I grew up camping, usually in crowded places where the worst thing that happened was someone's kid throwing marshmallows at your tent. But after losing my job earlier that year, I had been living out of my Volkswagen, wandering from campground to campground, trying to figure out what came next. I didn't know then that the next thing would be fear. Not the dramatic kind, you see in movies, but the quiet, creeping kind that rewires your instincts before your brain realizes what's happening. The road into Ridgetop Springs wound between dead junipers and the empty concrete pads where RVs once parked. There were no lights, no signs of recent life, just a row of old electric hookups that stood like grave markers for forgotten vacations. For a moment, I considered turning around, but the wind shoved again and fatigue pinned me in place. So I eased the Volkswagen into the first open spot I found, killed the engine, and listened to the metal tick as it cooled. The silence felt staged, deliberate. Even the desert insects had gone quiet. I told myself I was being dramatic. But the longer I sat there, the more I sensed something subtle pressing at my awareness, like a presence leaning close enough to whisper without words. I don't know why I stepped out of the van, but I did. And as my boots met the cracked asphalt, the air carried a faint smell that didn't belong to the desert. Wet soil, as if the earth had been recently turned over. I glanced around, no other vehicles, no RVs or tents, just my lone Volkswagen, the wind, and that strange smell. The checkout building sat at the far end of the lot, a faded wooden office with a triangular roof that had once been painted cheerful colors in the 80s. Now the paint peeled like dry skin. A metal flagpole stood beside it, no flag attached, but the rope clinked softly against the pole even though there was no breeze. That detail stuck with me. Just the flag rope swayed again, no wind, no movement, yet it tapped as if someone were pushing it. I swallowed, feeling something tighten in my chest, and forced myself to look away. You're tired, Avery. You're imagining things. But I wasn't imagining the footprints. They were faint, almost erased by time, a set of large, oddly spaced impressions in the brittle dirt near the office door. Not animal, not human, something in between, or something outside both categories. My first instinct was denial. My second was to follow them. I'm not claiming that was smart, but exhaustion does strange things to judgment. I took a few steps toward them, and as I crouched to inspect the nearest print, something about its depth told me that whatever made it had been heavy, very heavy. I stood up too fast, my head spinning. That's when I heard it. A tap, then another, soft, measured, like knuckles on thin metal. I froze. The sound came from behind the office, just out of sight, not a random creak, not an animal scratching, a rhythm, intentional. 2 taps, pause, 2 taps, a code of some sort. My throat tightened. I don't remember making a conscious decision. I only remember finding myself backing toward my van. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but adrenaline was already threading through my chest. When the taps stopped, the silence felt like a held breath. I reached the Volkswagen, my hand shaking as I slid the door open. The smell hit me again. Wet dirt, stronger now, like something freshly unearthed. I climbed inside, shut the door, and locked it. The van felt suddenly too small, too fragile, as if I were sitting inside a tin can in a world full of rocks. I pulled the curtains closed, but left a narrow crack near the windshield. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Nothing. My body relaxed just enough that I considered laughing at myself. Maybe the taps were old pipes, contracting. Maybe the prints were from equipment the old owners had used. Maybe I was just tired. But then, about 30 minutes after I'd locked myself inside, I noticed movement near the office. Something slow. Something deliberate. A shadow stretched across the pavement, long and distorted, like a figure hunched forward. It moved as though dragging itself, not limping, but shifting its weight in an unbalanced, unnatural way. I leaned closer to the windshield to focus that, but the angle distorted the shape even more. It didn't look human, but it didn't look like any animal I recognized. My chest tightened. My instincts screamed. I ducked below the dashboard, my breath shaking. The shadow stopped. Silence settled. Then the smell flooded the air inside the van. Damp earth, soil disturbed by something large lifting itself out. I covered my mouth, trying not to breathe too loudly. A rustle brushed against the side of the Volkswagen. Not a touch. Not a knock. A drag. Something tracing the vehicle. The van shifted slightly, as if weight pressed against it. I squeezed my eyes shut, begging it not to tip, to stay still, to let me pretend I wasn't there. The dragging circled the van, slow and curious, every movement making the Volkswagen rock a little, as if whatever explored me were deciding whether to push harder. When it reached the back, it paused. My heartbeat filled my ears. Then I heard it. Right behind me, inches from the rear hatch. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Every hair on my body rose. Whatever it was had followed me. It hadn't been tapping randomly on the building. It had been tapping to see who would answer. I pressed my back against the front seats, trying to become as small as possible. The tapping repeated, this time with a faint, wet sound between the strikes, like soil sliding off something. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, without warning, the rear hatch window flexed inward. Not much, just enough for me to see the glass shift in the curtain's reflection. Something pressed its weight against the window. The smell grew stronger, suffocating. I was about to reach for the keys, prepared to drive blind if necessary, when the pressure suddenly lifted. The weight withdrew. Silence fell so completely it hurt. I stayed frozen. Minutes passed, maybe more. My legs went numb, but I didn't dare shift. Only when the desert wind finally returned, whistling across the empty RV pads, did I move toward the curtains, my breath catching. I opened them a fraction of an inch. The shadow was gone. The office stood quiet again, the flagpole rope hanging still. I exhaled shakily, convinced the worst had passed, but then I noticed new footprints leading away from my van. Deep, fresh, and headed toward the far side of the campground, toward the abandoned RV park trail that led into the hills. I should have stayed inside. But something in me, something irrational and wounded from months of drifting and disappointment, whispered that running from fear would only make it follow me. That if I didn't understand what I had seen, I would carry it with me into every campground that followed. So I grabbed my flashlight, opened the door, and stepped back into the desert night, determined to see where those prints led. And that was my first mistake. The desert night greeted me with a cold so sharp it felt almost metallic, cutting straight through the heat the day had left behind. My flashlight flickered as if it were questioning my decision right along with me, but I forced it steady and followed the prints leading away from the Volkswagen. They cut through the brittle crust of earth in long strides, too long for any person to make naturally, but not impossible, unless that person was hauling something heavy or contorting their body in some unnatural way. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I'd spent too long ignoring my gut. Too long convincing myself that fear was just imagination. I knew what fear was now, something that crawled inside you and took shape whether you gave it permission or not. And something about this place, this abandoned RV town with its broken electric hookups and peeling office paint, felt like the physical manifestation of everything I hadn't processed since losing my job, since my relationship ended, since I started drifting with no plan beyond each day's sunset. The prints stopped at the trailhead leading into the hills. Ridgetop Springs hiking trail had once been maintained. The wooden map post still stood, though the map had faded until only faint blue rivers remained. I remembered reading months earlier about old RV towns being shut down because of drought, contamination, or dangerous wildlife, but none of that explained the smell, or the tapping, or the way the shadow moved like it was dragging a memory with it. I followed the trail, my breath fogging the beam of my flashlight. The air grew colder still, unnaturally cold, the kind that didn't belong in the desert at night, even in winter. It felt like descending, even though the path climbed upward. 5 minutes in, the smell returned, faint at first, like turned soil from a freshly dug garden. I slowed, scanning the brush. The desert shrubs twitched with the wind, but something rustled deeper among them, moving parallel to me. Not approaching, just watching. I tried to keep my steps quiet, but every crack of gravel felt like a spotlight. The trail narrowed, twisting between limestone boulders. I searched for the prints, but the ground had grown too hard. All I had now was the smell and the rustling in the brush that moved when I moved, stopped when I stopped. I wasn't alone, and it wanted me to know that. The moon slid out from behind a thin veil of clouds, silvering the trail. The landscape widened, revealing an old wooden sign broken in half, leaning against a rock. The intact part read, "Ridge. Camp." I could imagine the rest. This trail once led campers to the upper sites, the premium spots with a view over the valley. That meant more abandoned spaces ahead, more places something could hide. The rustling stopped, silence settled, thick and suffocating. Then I heard it, a soft thud like something heavy stepping onto packed dirt. Then another, slow, measured. My chest tightened. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam fractured against the rocks. Something shifted behind them, massive enough to distort the shadows. I aimed again, catching the briefest flash of movement, a limb maybe, but bent wrong, a shape but stretched. Then the smell hit me full force, wet soil, freshly opened ground. I stumbled back, my boot catching on a root, sending me into the rock wall. The sound echoed down the trail, the thing stopped moving. A long moment passed. I forced myself to breathe quietly, to keep my hands steady. The flashlight trembled anyway. Then, 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. This time they weren't against metal or wood. They were against stone, like knuckles tapping a tomb wall. The sound came from the other side of the boulder. The smell thickened, suffocating in its closeness. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But something else held me in place, a memory I hadn't expected. My father teaching me how to camp when I was a kid, his voice steady as he said, "Fear is a signal, not a sentence. It tells you something wants your attention." So I gave my attention. I stepped closer. The smell grew heavier, but I leaned around the edge of the rock anyway, shining my light into the small clearing beyond. Something crouched near the ground. Large. Pale in patches where the light struck its skin. And wrong. Wrong in proportion. Wrong in posture. Wrong in every way the body instinctively rejects. It didn't look like a cryptid from folklore. It didn't look like an animal from nightmares. It looked like something pulled halfway from the earth and not meant to live above it. Its spine arched steeply, vertebrae protruding through stretched skin. Its arms were long, ending in blunt, soil-packed fingers. Its head, I couldn't make out its full shape, only that it tilted slightly, listening to the scrape of my breath. I tried to step back quietly, but gravel shifted beneath my heel. The creature lifted its head. Its eyes weren't glowing or monstrous. They were empty, sockets filled with something soft and pale, eyes with no direction, yet somehow fixed on me. It rose slowly, unfolding like an animal rediscovering its bones. Its height surpassed mine within seconds. When it stood fully upright, its form wavered in the beam as though the air resisted its presence. Then it tapped the rock again. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. I don't know what instinct took over, but I bolted. I spun so fast my shoulder cracked against stone, pain shooting down my arm. I ran blindly, the flashlight beam leaping across rocks and shrubs. My breath burned my throat, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear it. Not footsteps, not a chase, just the rustling. The brush shifting beside me, perfectly matching my speed. It wasn't chasing me. It was hurting me. The trail widened, and I stumbled into the remnants of the upper campground. Concrete pads, old picnic tables, rusted fire rings. The night pressed into the corners of the site like breath in a cold room. I spun, searching for the creature, but the brush was still. The smell lingered, faint but present, like something buried nearby. A metal glint caught my eye, an old RV, half collapsed, sitting crooked on its axles. The windows were broken, the door hanging by a single hinge. Something about it felt familiar, like I'd seen it in a photo, maybe in a news article about a family disappearing out here. I approached slowly, hands trembling. Inside, the RV was empty, except for dust, shredded fabric, and the outlines on the floor where furniture had once been bolted down. But the smell was stronger inside, overwhelming. I covered my mouth, but it still slipped through, clinging to my tongue like mud. I stepped farther in, shining the light along the walls. Then I saw them, finger marks, 4 long, deep grooves etched into the metal siding. Not scratches, grips, as if something had pulled itself along the wall. I backed up, heart racing. My light hit something on the far side of the RV, a large shape wrapped in a ragged tarp. I approached, dread swirling in my stomach. The tarp sagged in the middle, weighted by something bulky. I lifted the edge. Inside was earth. Dark, wet soil piled high, packed into the RV as if shoveled straight from the ground. My hands went cold. What I'd smelled wasn't decay, it was origin. This thing didn't come from the hills, it came from the ground itself. And then, behind me, 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps, close, very close. I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking so hard the beam jittered across the walls. The tapping came again, this time from just outside the RV's broken doorway. Something waited there, listening, and I realized the creature hadn't followed me into the upper campground to chase me. It had followed me here for something else, for someone else. Because carved into the inside of the RV doorframe, half hidden beneath dust, was a name, Avery, my name, but not carved recently, carved years ago. My heart stopped. Something had been waiting for me, or something had been waiting for someone who shared my name. And in that moment, I understood just how deep the legends of abandoned RV towns might go. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The name carved into the metal doorframe didn't make sense. Not here, not in an abandoned RV that had been left to rot years before I was ever old enough to drive, much less wander the desert alone. I ran my fingers across the jagged lines, feeling the roughness of old etching. The grooves were weathered, oxidized, unmistakably aged. Avery. It wasn't recent. It wasn't for me, but everything in my chest tightened, as if the desert itself had reached in and grabbed hold of my lungs, because I knew that name, not my own, but the other one. The other Avery. My brother. My twin. The one I lost when we were 13. I hadn't spoken his name out loud in decades. Not because I wanted to forget him, but because remembering him meant reopening something that never healed right. He disappeared in Oregon after wandering off during a camping trip. Search teams found nothing, not a sock, not a scrap of fabric, nothing. Some said he drowned, some said he ran away, most said he got lost. No one ever considered anything stranger than that, except me. I'd spent years wondering if something else had taken him, something beyond explanation. Something that existed in the gaps of woods and deserts and mountains where search parties never looked because they didn't believe in the possibility of anything but human error. And now here I was, staring at his name carved into the wall of a decaying RV hundreds of miles away from where he vanished. My breath trembled. The creature wasn't inside the RV yet, but I could feel it outside. A pressure, a presence, a weight against the air that warped the silence. My flashlight dimmed, then flared weakly again as if reacting to whatever waited beyond the broken doorframe. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. This time softer, almost hesitant. Not like a threat, more like a summons. My pulse hammered so hard I felt it in the backs of my eyes. I backed away from the door, every muscle screaming for me to run, but something deeper kept my feet rooted where they were. Something old and familiar. Something the air remembered even if I tried not to. I whispered my brother's name without realizing it. The word came out cracked, almost broken. The smell of wet soil seeped further into the RV, settling around my ankles, swirling like fog that couldn't decide whether to rise or sink. I aimed my flashlight toward the doorway, and for a single disorienting moment, I saw a shape that didn't match the creature at all. A figure small enough to be a child, standing just beyond the threshold. I blinked, and the shape vanished. In its place, the large, wrong silhouette returned, hunched, shifting, its limbs hanging in unnatural arcs. But something inside me split open at the sight of that small figure, that impossible glimpse. My rational mind screamed that it was fear, exhaustion, hallucination. But the deeper part of me, the instinctual, bone-deep part, knew better. The creature took one slow step toward the entrance. The RV creaked under the change in pressure. My flashlight flickered again, then steadied just enough to illuminate the soil caked along its arms. Soil that clung the way grave dirt clings to something newly risen. When it lifted its head toward me, I took a step back, but the RV wall pressed cold and unyielding against my spine. I had nowhere to go. The creature tapped the doorway again. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. And suddenly I remembered something I hadn't thought of in years, a rhythm my brother and I used when we were kids. A secret knock on our bedroom wall so our parents wouldn't hear us whispering late at night. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. It was our signal, our code, our way of saying, I'm here. A tightness in my chest broke loose. I shook my head as if trying to clear sand from my ears. This thing wasn't him. It couldn't be. Yet my voice trembled as I whispered into the stale RV air. What are you? The creature shifted, a slow roll of movement that sent fresh soil crumbling off its shoulders. Its empty eye sockets fixed toward my voice, and for the first time since I'd seen it, I noticed faint cracks along its skin, tiny fissures that glowed dull amber beneath the surface like something molten but cooling. The air around it vibrated, low and resonant like a distant hum beneath the desert floor. It stepped closer. The RV doorframe groaned. I backed to the far end, nearly tripping over the tarp-covered mound of soil. Panic clawed up my throat, raw and rising. I thought about running past it, but the idea alone felt like stepping willingly into a grave. Then faintly, behind the creature's steady breathing, I heard something else. A whisper. Not in words. Not in sound. In memory. The memory of my brother calling my name from across a forest trail the day he vanished, his voice echoing through trees I could never see through. His laughter turning into something I could never reach. My legs shook. I didn't know if the creature was mimicking him. I didn't know if it was something older that borrowed old signals. I didn't know if it was warning me, calling me, or claiming me. But I knew I had to move. The creature lifted one arm, soil dripping from its fingers in thick clumps. It brushed the doorframe with a sound that wasn't a tap this time, but a drag. A long, heavy drag. I darted right, squeezing between the broken cabinets and the window frame. The creature lunged slightly, reacting to the movement, and its arm struck the RV wall with a deep thud. Dust burst into the air. The ground vibrated beneath us. I forced my body through the shattered window, the glass slicing into my jacket, my palms scraping against jagged metal. I fell hard onto the dirt outside, pain flaring through my shoulder. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted toward the trail. Behind me, the creature let out a sound, not a roar, not a growl, but something low and guttural, like earth cracking open under pressure. I didn't look back. The trail blurred under the frantic swing of my flashlight. My lungs burned, my legs shaking violently with every step. The night distorted around me, shapes bending in the corners of my vision. The smell chased me, thickening, drowning the air. The taps returned, not from one place, from many. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. On rocks, on dead wood, on the ground beneath my feet. Like a signal spreading through the desert, like a warning, or a gathering. I stumbled down the slope, grabbed a boulder to regain balance, then nearly crashed into the old wooden map post. I pushed myself forward, reaching the lower campground. My Volkswagen sat alone in the dark, facing the open road like it had been waiting for me the whole time. I fumbled the keys, dropped them, cursed. Grabbed them again with shaking hands. Behind me, the rustling grew louder. More than one source now. More than one creature. The tapping intensified. I unlocked the van, threw myself inside, and slammed the door. The moment the lock clicked, something heavy pressed against the back of the vehicle. The van shifted, rocking slightly. I jammed the key into the ignition, my breath breaking into frantic gasps. The engine sputtered. No, not now. I tried again. The tapping started on the driver's side window. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Then a deeper, heavier sound hit the back of the van. A thump so forceful, though the whole vehicle tilted forward. I turned the key again. The engine caught. I slammed it into gear and tore out of the campsite, gravel spraying behind me. The van lurched onto the access road, tires skidding against loose dirt. In my rearview mirror, for a single shattering moment, I saw several silhouettes emerging from the brush. Tall, hunched, staggering, all moving with that same unbalanced rhythm. They didn't chase me. They stood watching. The road curved sharply, and the silhouettes disappeared behind the ridge. I drove until the abandoned town shrank into a distant blur of darkness. Only when I was miles away did I pull over, hands trembling violently on the steering wheel. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my pulse throbbed in my neck. The smell of wet soil clung to my clothes. I sat there for a long time, staring into the empty highway, trying to convince myself the carvings in that RV meant nothing, that the creature's taps meant nothing, that my brother's name was a coincidence carved by some stranger decades before. But deep in my chest, past fear, past reason, something settled into place. Not certainty, not belief, but something else. A knowing. Some legends aren't found. They're unearthed. They wait underground in abandoned places, in forgotten RV towns where the earth remembers what people try to forget. And when you step into those places carrying your own ghosts, they rise to meet you. I drove until dawn, the sun bleeding over the desert horizon in muted gold. The warmth touched my skin for the first time in hours, and only then did I realize I wasn't done running. Not from monsters, not from legends, but from the past I thought I had buried long ago. And somewhere behind me, beneath the dirt, beneath the silence, beneath all the things that never stay dead, something tapped twice, paused, and tapped twice again, as if promising, I'm here, always, even in the places no one dares to remember. I always tell people the same thing when they ask why I still camp alone in the Pacific Northwest. Some places teach you who you are by showing you what you fear. My name is Mark, 46 years old, born and raised in coastal Washington, and I've spent more nights in a rust blue Volkswagen camper than I ever spent in my childhood bedroom. I've learned to trust rain like a companion, and I've learned that silence out here. Silence is never just silence. It's a presence. It leans in. It listens. The night that changed me started in that kind of silence. Soft, padded, the kind that comes right after a storm. You'd think it would be calming, but it wasn't. It felt like the forest was waiting for something. I was parked near an old service road north of Forks, a place locals always told me to avoid because the logging companies abandoned it decades ago. They said the trees grew back strange there, leaning over the road like they were trying to keep something in. I didn't believe them. I'd heard enough campfire stories to last a lifetime, and all of them had the same predictable warning: stay out of the places where the map ends. But that was the point. I wanted to be away from everyone, away from the noise of a life that always felt too crowded with other people's expectations. So when I saw the faded sign that read road closed, unstable ground, I didn't turn around. I eased the Volkswagen onto the gravel, listening to the crunch under the tires, feeling the damp air gather against the windows as the forest swallowed me. When you drive alone long enough, your thoughts start behaving like strange animals. Mine drifted back to my brother, to the last time we camped together before he passed. He always had a way of reading the woods, feeling them. He used to say, "The forest talks. You just never want to hear what it says when it goes quiet." I'd laughed at that, but that night, entering that narrow road between the cedar trunks, something about his words tugged at me. I found a clearing just big enough for the van. The ground still glistened from the storm. Branches hung low, dripping. I could smell wet moss thick as wool and something else, something metallic, something like old tools left out too long. I stepped out into it, letting the cold air hit my face, and the first shiver that went through me wasn't from the temperature. It was recognition. This place wasn't deserted. It was observing. I set up camp anyway. That's the thing about denial. You cling to it because admitting fear means admitting you're not in control. I heated a small pot of soup on the portable stove, left the side door cracked open, and listened to the forest breathe. Crickets, the drip of rain, the distant groan of branches shifting under their own weight. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. Every noise felt a little too patterned, like something mimicking rhythm. It wasn't until the third time I heard the tapping that my hand froze halfway to my bowl. It was soft, close, like knuckles brushing lightly against metal. I listened, holding my breath. Tap, tap, tap. My first instinct was to rationalize. Branch, dropping water, a pine cone falling just right. The Pacific Northwest is a symphony of things falling on other things. But then it came again from the other side of the van this time. Tap, tap, tap. That pattern, shifted location, same rhythm, drove a tiny wedge of cold through my chest. I turned off the stove, stepped to the doorway, and leaned out. Nothing, just the trees standing there, packed tight, every trunk dark and wet and smooth like they'd been polished. I tried to laugh at myself, but even that sound felt out of place in the clearing. I closed up the van, locked the doors, and told myself to get some sleep. Storms make forests twitchy, animals get restless, humans get paranoid. That's the formula. But an hour later, the tapping came back, louder this time. Not frantic, not even aggressive, just deliberate. Like someone testing the van's skin with the back of their hand. I sat up so fast my head hit the cabinet above me. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the window. Nothing pressed against the glass. No silhouette, no hand. But the sound was unmistakably close, and it didn't move away when I shined the light. That's when denial started to fracture. You never notice it breaking in a dramatic moment. It splits quietly like a seam coming undone. I found myself whispering my brother's name, like he might answer, like he might give me one of those steadying phrases that always made the woods seem less ominous. But whispering felt wrong. It felt like giving something permission to come closer. I forced myself to lie back down, keeping the flashlight in one hand. I listened to the tapping, trying to map it in my head, where it moved, when it paused, how long between taps. The more I listened, the less random it seemed. Not an animal. Not a branch. Too controlled, too intentional. At some point, I realized the forest had gone completely silent. Even the dripping had stopped. I sat up again, slowly, this time moving like I might disturb something sitting right next to me in the dark. I held my breath. And that's when I heard it. The unmistakable crunch of gravel under a weight. A heavy one. Slow. One step. Then another. Coming from behind the van. The windows were fogged from my breath, so I wiped a small circle clear and pressed my face to the glass. My beam of light cut through the clearing, slicing shadows apart. Nothing moved, but the gravel, it kept crunching. Closer. Closer. Then it stopped, right beside the driver's door. I felt every muscle in my body tighten at once, as if the entire forest had reached inside the van and hold of me. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what might be there. But fear doesn't freeze your body the way people think. It floods you with urgency. It whispers, move before it does. So I clicked the flashlight off as slowly as I could and listened. A long, deep exhale blew across the driver's window. My throat closed. Not breath from wind. Not breath from an animal. Human breath. Wet, warm, soft enough to fog glass. I didn't breathe at all then. Every instinct screamed at me to stay perfectly still, but another part of me, the part that had ignored so many red flags in my life, pushed me to get a closer look. Just a little. Just enough to know. I leaned forward and squinted through the fogged-over window. Something pale moved on the other side of the glass. Then, a fingertip dragged down the window, slow and deliberate, carving a clean line in the fog. I recoiled so fast the van shook. The fingertip withdrew. Silence. The kind of silence that swallows every thought you have and replaces it with one question. What wants you quiet? The fingertip didn't return to the window. It simply vanished into the darkness, leaving behind that one thin line carved through fog, like a reminder that whoever or whatever stood on the other side already knew exactly where I was. I kept staring at it, waiting for the next sound, the next breath, anything. But the world outside the van stayed unnervingly still. I've spent years camping alone, in every type of weather and terrain the Pacific Northwest can offer. I've waited out storms that made the earth vibrate. I've heard cougars scream in the timberline at 2 a.m. I've even watched a bear push its weight against the van door like it was checking the seal on a cooler. But nothing prepared me for the feeling that settled into my bones right then. It wasn't the fear of being hunted. It was the fear of being studied. The clearing felt wrong. I felt wrong inside it, like something had already decided what happened next, and I was just catching up. I slid off the bed silently, reaching for the multi-tool near the small sink, even though I knew a multi-tool wasn't going to save me from anything capable of breathing like that. But holding something, anything, made my hands stop shaking. The gravel outside didn't move again. No footsteps, no breathing, no tapping, just the dense, suffocating quiet of a forest holding its breath. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Fear stretches time, makes it elastic and untrustworthy. I kept my eyes on the windows, trying not to blink. At some point, I realized I was gripping the multi-tool so hard the metal edges dug into my palm. I forced myself to breathe. In, out, slow, controlled, a steady rhythm that might keep panic from overtaking logic. Then something changed. The Volkswagen shifted. Not rocked by wind, not nudged by an animal. It lifted. Maybe an inch, maybe less. But enough that the suspension gave a soft metallic groan, an unmistakable noise, the kind you hear when the van rolls over uneven ground. Something was under it. I froze. Every nerve in my body screamed no, all at once, a warning that felt older than me, the kind of instinct humans aren't supposed to ignore. But then, as gently as it lifted, the van settled again, a slow descent, a long, creaking sigh of metal sinking back into earth. I stumbled backward, barely processing it. My breath hitched, caught painfully in my chest. I couldn't think, couldn't rationalize. I just knew I had to get out of that clearing before whatever was beneath me, or beside me, decided the van wasn't enough of a barrier. I crawled into the front seat, keeping my head low, and grabbed the keys. My hands were shaking too much to get them into the ignition on the first try, or the second. It took 3 attempts before the metal slid in. When I finally turned the key, nothing happened. Not a click, not a cough. Dead. Completely dead. The van had never done that. Not once. I'd rebuilt half the engine with my own hands. I knew every sound it made. For it to go silent without warning, I leaned back, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. If something had drained the battery or ripped out wiring while I was inside, if that breath, that fingertip, meant something was close enough to touch the van, a shape moved along the passenger side window. Not a shadow, not a silhouette, a reflection. A smear of pale skin glided across the glass like someone was dragging their hand along the outside. I ducked out of sight immediately, gripping the steering wheel with both hands. My breath stuttered. My pulse hammered in my ears so hard it drowned out everything else. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, abandon the van, and sprint down the road until my lungs burst. But the clearing had no moonlight left, no visible path. The trees pressed too close, swallowing any direction except deeper into the forest. Running blind out there would mean breaking an ankle, or worse. I stayed where I was, hunched down, barely breathing. Then a soft, rhythmic sound started beneath me. Not tapping, breathing. I felt it, not heard it through the metal floor. Slow, wet, labored, as if whatever hid under the van needed to inhale deeply just to exist. The vibration traveled up my legs, through the soles of my shoes, into the pit of my spine. I clamped a hand over my mouth. Don't make a sound. Don't move. Don't give it anything. The breathing grew louder, closer, rising from beneath the floor until it felt like something was exhaling directly into the metal beneath my feet. Then silence. Then a whisper, right under the driver's seat. A voice. Human in shape, but not human in sound. A low, dragging tone that scraped like something learning how to speak through mud. I couldn't understand the words. Not at first. They were warped, stretched, shaped wrong, but they formed a rhythm, a cadence. Something that might have once been language before it decayed. Then, finally, I recognized the sound. It was repeating the tapping rhythm, in words, my tapping rhythm, the one I used on the dashboard when I was nervous. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to mimic me. My throat closed. I pressed myself flat across the seats, gripping the upholstery, praying the van held together long enough for whatever this was to lose interest. Then the whisper stopped. Then the breathing stopped. Then the forest came back. The crickets, the rain dripping, a faint wind pushing through the clearing, like someone flipped a switch. I waited long after the sounds returned, listening for movement, for another breath, for the scrape of skin on metal. Nothing. Not even a hint. It was as though the presence vanished, dissolved into the ground beneath the van. And the moment it was gone, a rush of emotion hit me so hard it felt like breaking open. Fear. Disbelief. A strange, collapsing grief I couldn't explain. I curled forward, pulling in sharp, thin breaths, forcing myself to stay quiet, even though every inch of me wanted to scream. After what felt like an eternity, I risked rising slowly, just enough to peek above the dashboard. The clearing looked exactly the way it had when I arrived. No footprints, no shapes, no sign of movement. But the fog on the driver's window still held that single-finger drag line, a mark carved by something that shouldn't exist. I knew then that staying until morning wasn't an option. I didn't care about the dead battery anymore. I'd push the van out of the clearing if I had to. I'd roll it downhill. Crawl to the highway, walk until sunrise, barefoot and bleeding if necessary. I wasn't spending another minute in that clearing. I reached for my bag, keeping my eyes fixed on the windows, refusing to blink. The driver's window began to fog again. Not from me. From outside. And this time, instead of a fingertip dragging a line, a full hand pressed flat against the glass. The hand didn't move. It stayed pressed against the glass with a slow, unsettling firmness, the way a person might test the warmth of a window on a winter morning. Except this wasn't morning, and whatever stood outside wasn't checking for warmth. The spread of the fingers was too wide, the palm too long, the shape almost human, but wrong in a way that hit something primitive inside me. A warning older than language. I stopped breathing, completely. The hand remained there, motionless, as if waiting for me to make the next move. Every instinct screamed to bolt out the opposite door, but I knew, deep down, it could move faster than I could. That thing wasn't tapping anymore. It was claiming closeness. The fog thickened around the imprint, spreading outward like the heat behind it wasn't natural body heat, but something hotter, heavier. My mind began scrambling through explanations, condensation, animals, a trick of the light, but none of them stood a chance. That hand was real, and it was inches from my face. Slowly, the fingertips curled one by one, dragging faint trails down the fogged glass. Not scratches, just long, slow strokes, as if it were petting the van. My stomach turned. I had the disorienting sense that I wasn't trapped by something hostile. I was trapped by something curious. And curiosity was worse. Hostility has limits. Curiosity lingers. I stayed frozen, crouched in the footwell, every nerve wired to the possibility that the hand might suddenly slam through the glass. But it didn't. It continued that slow, petting drag, like it was memorizing the shape of the window. Then the breathing started again. Not from beneath me this time, from just outside the glass. A drawn-out exhale, fogging the window so thickly I couldn't see the outline of the trees anymore. Whatever stood there had leaned close, too close, and was breathing directly against the glass. Its breath moved in a rhythm that didn't match anything human. Deep inhale, short exhale, pause, repeat, like it had to remember the sequence each time. The panic inside me had grown legs and was pacing hard across my chest. I pressed my back against the passenger door, gripping the multi-tool in one hand and my keys in the other. Useless items. But holding them made me feel less like prey. Then the breathing stopped. The hand lifted off the glass. A faint shift in gravel. Something stepped backward, just enough that the fogged imprint of the hand remained untouched, suspended there like an accusation. I didn't dare look. Not fully. But in my peripheral vision, I caught it, a shape standing in the dark. Tall, lean. A distorted silhouette that didn't match the trunk of any tree. Shoulders slightly hunched, like it hadn't quite mastered how to stand upright. I swallowed hard, barely able to move my tongue. I needed a plan. Escape wasn't about speed. It was about timing. If I could wait until it shifted again, until it took another step away, I could. Then it spoke. Not loudly, not clearly. More like a throat learning how to push air into sound. The voice came from the shape, but it sounded like it came from underneath the van too. A layered echo, a mimicry of depth. The same scraping tone I'd heard earlier. Mark. Hearing my name in that voice nearly made my knees buckle. I'd never felt a sound hit so physically. It was like the syllables crawled over my skin. No one knew I was here. No one. Then it repeated the tapping rhythm in that broken, distorted voice. Tap, 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 exactly the way I'd tapped on the dashboard earlier that evening. Exactly. The clearing tilted. The van felt smaller. My breath quickened, shallow and uneven. Whatever stood out there hadn't just found me. It was learning me. It took a step closer. The gravel crackled under its weight. I squeezed my eyes shut just for a second, gathering whatever fragments of logic I had left. Fear had a way of filling every corner of your mind until you couldn't think, couldn't choose. But choice is the only weapon you have when you're outmatched. I had 2 doors, a small clearing, a steep drop-off behind me somewhere, and a forest thick enough to lose anything, including myself. But the road behind the van sloped downhill. If I could get the van rolling, battery dead or not, it might pick up enough speed for me to jump-start it. That meant I needed to move now. Before the thing realized what I was trying to do, I slid slowly into the driver's seat, every joint stiff, every breath trembling. The shape outside didn't move. It just watched, its dark outline framed thickly by fog. It spoke my name again. Mark. Longer this time. Dragged out, as if it liked the taste of the sound. I turned the key. Once. Twice. Dead. I tried again, panic rising so fast it blurred the edges of my vision. Nothing. But the van wasn't completely lifeless. Something clicked faintly under the dash, a tiny relay firing. Not enough to turn over an engine, but enough to tell me that something was draining power, something external. I leaned forward, staring at the fogged window. The handprint was still there, but now there was another one, smaller. Right below it, 2 hands, different sizes, or one creature with hands that didn't match. The second handprint trembled like it was tapping just once, without sound. The shape moved, its silhouette elongated, edges rippling. It leaned closer and the breathing returned, a low, heavy flutter against the glass. That was my moment. I shoved the gear into neutral with a hard jerk, kicked open the driver's door, and threw my entire weight toward the front to push the van downhill. The creature reacted instantly. A sharp, guttural noise tore from its throat, a sound too close to a scream for something that shouldn't be able to scream. The gravel exploded under its movement as it lunged. But downhill momentum is a weapon. The van shifted, rolled, gained a foot. The thing reached the side of the van, slamming its weight into the metal. The frame shook so violently I almost fell. But momentum kept building. 2 feet, 3. The van rolled faster. I sprinted along the side, pushing until my legs burned, until the van was moving faster than I could keep up. Then I ran around and leapt into the open driver's doorway, grabbing the steering wheel with both hands. The shape followed, fast enough that it stayed visible in my peripheral vision. Too fast, impossibly fast. But the slope dragged me away, pulling the van into a rough, bouncing descent. The creature reached out, its fingertips scraped the frame, a long, screeching drag of something too strong against metal. But the van kept rolling. 10 feet. 20. The clearing receded behind me, swallowed by trees. I yanked the door shut. The shape didn't chase into the road. It simply stood at the edge of the clearing, watching, chest rising and falling in a slow, unnatural rhythm. As the forest swallowed the curve of the road, its voice followed me, stretched and warped through the trees. Mark. I didn't breathe again until the van finally rolled onto level ground and slowed. I kept my hands on the wheel, shaking uncontrollably, staring into the rearview mirror even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. The forest behind me was still, too still. When the van finally stopped, I put it in park and just sat there. Minutes passed. My body trembled in leftover panic. My breath came in shallow, broken pulls. But eventually, slowly, I found enough strength to turn the key again. The engine started. Clean. Perfect. Like nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't question it. I didn't look back. I drove until the sky shifted from black to the faint gray of dawn, until the trees thinned and the cold Pacific air blew through the cracked window like absolution. But the story doesn't end there. Because even now, months later, whenever the windows fog on cold mornings, I see it. That second handprint, smaller, trembling, tapping without sound. I used to tell myself the second handprint was just residue, something my mind invented in the haze of panic, something my breath created and my fear shaped. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the more that trembling little imprint seemed to follow me. It appeared on cold mornings, sure, but not every cold morning, only on the ones when the forest air felt a little too heavy, only when the fog settled just right. Only when I woke with the feeling that someone had stood outside the van while I slept. And every time, I wiped it away before I could think too long about what it meant. But some truths don't go away just because you refuse to look at them. If anything, they sharpen. They wait. 2 weeks after I escaped that clearing, I found myself driving the same stretch of Highway 101, following the coastline south, trying to outrun whatever had embedded itself into the back of my skull. I didn't camp in forests anymore, not then. I stayed in well-lit RV parks near other travelers where the laughter of strangers and the hum of generators made me feel like I was part of the human world again. But fear isn't a place, it's a tether. You drag it with you. I woke one morning in a crowded campground near Newport, the kind of place where kids ride scooters down the gravel lane and someone always burns bacon at sunrise, only to find that same small handprint on the inside of my windshield. Inside. Not out. And the glass wasn't fogged from cold. It was fogged unevenly, like someone had leaned their face close, breathed gently, then pressed that trembling hand along the bottom corner of the glass. I sat there for a long time, staring at it, unable to move. My coffee went cold in my hands. The sun rose higher. People walked past the van, oblivious to the way my world was collapsing inward. That was the moment I realized something had followed me out of that clearing. Not the creature, not the tall silhouette, not the voice scraping my name through fog, something else. A presence, a memory. A part of the van or a part of me. I cleaned the windshield twice that morning, scrubbing until my knuckles reddened, but I knew that wasn't the problem. Cleaning windows meant nothing when the fear lived behind your ribs. I drove inland, chasing distance like it was a cure, through Salem, past Eugene, into the foothills. I avoided the forests, but the forests didn't avoid me. The pines pressed close along the road. The shadows grew taller in my mirrors. Every time I slowed at a stop sign, I felt that same pressure of being watched, the same faint vibration under the floor as if something remembered how my heartbeat sounded. By the time I reached the Cascades, I wasn't trying to escape it anymore. I was trying to understand it, because a part of me believed, quietly, stubbornly, that if something followed me out of that clearing, then something else had stayed behind. That thought twisted inside me. My brother's face surfaced in my memory again. Uninvited. His final hike, the one I wasn't there for. The way he'd always said the forest talks, and how I had always been the one too stubborn to listen. Fear changes the way you connect dots. It makes you see patterns in places where maybe, just maybe, there shouldn't be any. But the handprint kept appearing. A week later, near Sisters, I woke to find not one, but 3 prints. One on the windshield, one on the side window, one on the cabinet door inside the van. That last one drained the strength from my body. I sank to the bed, shaking, staring at the wood panel where the faint, small imprint pulsed in the early sunlight. It wasn't just following me, it was moving. At night, inside. I wanted to open the door and scream into the empty campground, but fear held me still. Fear and something else, something quieter, something I didn't want to name. Because the smaller handprint, it didn't feel threatening, it felt pleading. That night, I drove without stopping, up toward Bend. Through the dark stretches where the trees crowd the road and the world narrows into 2 small cones of headlight. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't sleep, not while those silent marks waited for me in the corners of my vision. Hours passed. The forest thickened. The road wound upward, higher and higher, until the air thinned and the smell of pine grew sharp enough to sting. Around midnight, The lights of the van flickered. Just once. Then again. The electrical panel hummed, a strange low vibration that I felt through the steering wheel. My stomach dropped. I recognized the sound immediately, that faint drain, the same one I'd heard in that clearing before the van died. My pulse doubled, tripled. I pulled over onto a narrow dirt turnout, tires crunching over needles. The headlights dimmed, then steadied. The forest felt alive around me, closer than it should have been. Listening. I killed the engine. The moment the van went silent, the air inside shifted. A soft exhale. Behind me, inside the van, I didn't turn around. Every hair on my arms lifted. My throat tightened as if a cold hand had wrapped around it. But I forced myself slowly, painfully, to look into the rearview mirror. At first, I saw nothing, just the dim outline of the bed, the cabinets, the curtains swaying faintly from the draft I'd forgotten to seal. Then a faint shape appeared, a handprint, pressed against the inside of the back window, small, trembling, followed by another, then a third, each print blooming in the fog like breath-forming shapes. My breath hitched. I gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather dug into my palms. The handprints weren't random. They formed a pattern, a line, a trail, leading from the back window to the cabinet door to the little mirror above the sink. They were guiding me, pointing, showing. I turned slowly toward the back of the van, trembling so hard my teeth clicked. The prints glistened faintly in the thin moonlight. They weren't threatening. They weren't taunting. They were asking. I didn't understand what for. But something in me, some quiet, buried instinct, whispered, "Listen." So I did. I slid from the driver's seat, knees weak, and crawled toward the back of the van. The prints stopped at the mirror. I stared at it. For a long moment, nothing changed. Then the mirror fogged over. Not all at once. In 3 long, slow breaths. Breath coming from behind me. I turned so fast I hit my shoulder on the cabinet, but no one was there. No movement. No shape. Just the cold air of the Cascades pressing through the cracked vent. I turned back to the mirror, heart slamming in my chest. A line appeared in the fog, not a handprint. A letter. Then another. The writing was shaky, uneven, like someone dragging their fingertip through condensation for the first time. M-A-R. The last letter didn't finish. The fog thinned. The message vanished. But I knew with a certainty that hollowed me out that the thing in the clearing, the tall shape, the voice dragging my name, wasn't what followed me. This was something else, smaller, weaker, afraid. A presence that wasn't trying to claim me. It was trying to warn me. The tall creature hadn't been alone in that clearing, and the thing that escaped with me wasn't supposed to. The forest outside shifted. A sound moved through the trees, low, distant, almost like a mournful groan, the same rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. My blood iced, because this time it wasn't mimicry. It was calling. I crawled back toward the driver's seat as the tapping grew louder, coming from the trees, echoing between the trunks, closer with every second. The van's lights flickered again. The electrical panel shuddered. The smaller presence inside the van seemed to recoil, pulling back into the corners like it feared what was outside. And in that split moment, terror flooded me, but so did clarity. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't meant to be the one running. I turned the key. The van started instantly. I slammed it into gear. The tapping at the tree line sharpened, closer, faster, louder now. No longer curious, but hunting. I hit the gas. The road dropped away beneath me as the van barreled downhill, engine roaring, headlights carving wild arcs through the dark. Behind me, somewhere in the trees, a voice rose. Not my name this time. Something older. Something hungry. Something I was never meant to hear twice. I didn't look back, not once. I drove until dawn washed the mountains in pale gold, until the van's engine hummed steady, until the world felt like it belonged to humans again. But even now, when the mornings are cold, even now, when the windows fog, sometimes, just before the handprint fades, I feel a small tremble under the floorboards. Not threatening, not warning, just holding on. And I don't know whether I'm supposed to save it or whether it's the only thing keeping the other one from finding me again. I should have known something was wrong the moment the wind stopped moving. It wasn't a dramatic silence, not the kind that slams into you like a warning. It was quieter than that, almost polite, as if the air itself were holding its breath the second my old Volkswagen's tires touched the gravel road leading into Willow Creek Campground. I remember thinking how strange it was to see the trees stand so still, their needles frozen like they'd been painted into place. I should have felt comfort pulling into a familiar campsite, one I'd visited a handful of times over the years. But instead, I felt that small, instinctive tightening in the gut, the kind you pretend isn't there because you're tired, because you already paid the campsite fee online, because turning around feels like admitting defeat. I was on my way back from a long weekend in Flagstaff, the kind of weekend where you breathe a little deeper, think a little clearer, and convince yourself you're ready to return to the routines waiting back home. I planned to push through the night, but around 10:30, fatigue hit hard. My name is Evan, 32, a Midwest transplant who still hasn't learned how to properly gauge nighttime distances in the Southwest. Back home, driving an hour meant passing towns, gas stations, restaurants. Out here, an hour feels like a suggestion the land might not honor. So when I saw the wooden sign for Willow Creek glowing in my headlights, it seemed like a reasonable place to stop. Familiar, convenient, safe. But familiar places can change on you without warning. The campground looked emptier than I expected for a cool early autumn night. Only one other campsite was taken, a small Class C motorhome parked a good distance away, lights dimmed, curtains drawn, no campfires, no laughter echoing through the trees, just the low hum of my Volkswagen as I pulled into spot 18, a site tucked between two tall ponderosa pines whose trunks seemed darker than I remembered. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, imagining the stillness, imagining the sense that the trees were watching me settle in, imagining the faint smell of something metallic in the air. I blamed fatigue, the kind that dulls your instincts and makes warnings feel like shadows you can swat away. I turned off the engine, and in the moment, the Volkswagen shuddered into silence. A strange heaviness settled around me, as if the campground exhaled and I hadn't earned the right to breathe the same air. I shook it off, stepped outside, stretched my legs, and took a few slow breaths. The cold was sharp, almost medicinal, and for a moment it helped me reset. I reminded myself of why I love camping in this old van, being able to park anywhere, crawl into my little sleeping nook, and let the night hold me for a while. I've always said a Volkswagen doesn't just take you places, it teaches you things. Patience, resourcefulness, the difference between pausing and running away. But that night would teach me something far more uncomfortable, that instincts you try to suppress will always find a way to rise. The first sound caught my attention before I even finished setting up my small folding chair. A soft tapping, rhythmic but faint, coming from somewhere deeper in the trees behind the campsite. It wasn't woodpeckers. I grew up with those, and their tapping is sharp and confident. This was slower, too deliberate. I turned to look, but the darkness beyond my lantern's glow was thick, almost velvety, swallowing detail. I listened again. Tap, pause, tap, tap. I told myself it was branches shifting in the breeze, except there was no breeze. The trees hadn't moved since I arrived. I didn't want to start the night with paranoia. So I finished arranging my things, telling myself a warm drink would settle me. I fired up my small propane stove, and the spark felt louder than it should have, echoing strangely through the pines. As the water heated, I walked a slow loop around my van, checking the area the way any camper does, looking for signs of animals, scanning for anything out of place. That's when I noticed something odd. Small piles of pine needles had been gathered into little mounds around the edges of my campsite. Not naturally scattered piles, these were arranged, almost like someone had scooped them together with their hands and left them in deliberate clusters. 5 piles, evenly spaced. It was so strange, so oddly intentional, that for a moment I wondered if a previous camper's kids had been playing some kind of game. But the piles looked fresh, too fresh. Their centers were darker, like something had soaked through the needles recently. I crouched down, touched one gently with 2 fingers, and immediately regretted it. The needles were damp, sticky. The metallic smell in the air grew sharper. I wiped my fingers on my jeans, trying not to imagine what that residue might have been. I stood up quickly, brushing off the unease creeping beneath my skin, forcing myself to breathe normally. I didn't want to think about those little mounds. I wanted to think about my warm drink, about crawling into the van and ending the night. Except the tapping resumed. Louder this time, closer. I turned sharply, lantern in hand, scanning the tree line. Nothing, only the oppressive stillness pressing in like a held breath. But the tapping didn't stop. Tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. Something about the rhythm made my skin prickle, like it was trying to form a pattern, a message, a count. I took a slow step backward toward the safety of my van, telling myself not to make sudden movements, as if the thing making the sound was watching me. Every instinct I had, the instincts I'd spent most of my adult life ignoring in favor of logic and convenience, was whispering to get inside and lock the doors. But I fought them, unwilling to let fear control me. Maybe that was my mistake. I climbed into the van, slid the door shut, and sat for a long moment in the dark before turning on the interior light. The soft glow made the small space feel warmer, more contained. I made my drink, trying to steady my nerves, and eventually stretched out in the back, listening to the quiet. For about 20 minutes, nothing happened. No tapping, no strange smells, just the soft hum of the van cooling down and the gentle rustle of my sleeping bag as I shifted. I almost convinced myself I had overreacted. Then came the second sound, one I felt before I heard. A slow, dragging motion across the ground outside, moving from the back of the van toward the sliding door. Not footsteps, not the quick scamper of animals. This was something being pulled, something heavy. Pine needles scraped softly beneath whatever it was, creating a sound so subtle that if the night hadn't been unnaturally silent, I might have missed it. But I didn't miss it. And once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. My breathing slowed on its own, as if my body were trying to make me invisible. I stared at the van door, praying I wouldn't hear anything else. But the dragging stopped right beside me, inches from where my head rested against the interior wall. Then the tapping began again. Not from the forest, from the metal panel of the van itself. Soft, deliberate, too close to be anything but intentional. Tap. Pause. Tap, tap. My blood turned cold. I wanted to speak, to yell, to say anything, and grit up, but my throat locked. I lay completely still, afraid that even the rhythm of my breathing might give away something I didn't want to give away. Tap, tap, tap. This time the taps were faster, closer, as if whoever or whatever was outside knew I was listening. The worst part wasn't the tapping, it was the whisper that followed, a thin, breathy exhale of my name. Not Evan. My full name. The name only my mother used when she was afraid for me. The whisper slid under the door and into the van like a draft. I froze, unable to blink, unable to swallow. Then the whisper came again, just a little louder, a little more familiar, like someone I used to know, someone who shouldn't be here, someone who shouldn't know where I was. It was impossible, completely impossible. But the voice outside spoke my name a third time, and my heart collapsed into panic. And when I finally forced myself to look out the small side window, just a quick glance, just to confirm I wasn't losing my mind, I saw someone standing there, too close, too still, half hidden by the pine. A shape I recognized, a face I hadn't seen in 4 years, a man who wasn't alive anymore, a friend I'd failed, a friend I never told the truth about. I should have kept driving. My breath stuttered the second my eyes focused enough to make out the shape outside. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a random traveler wandering through the trees. It was Jonah, 28 years old forever, wearing the same faded green jacket he had on the night he disappeared near Sedona. A jacket we never found. A jacket I secretly prayed had been buried somewhere peaceful, not draped over a body wandering beneath the pines of an empty campground. The sight of him rocked something foundational in me, some part of my mind that had spent years sealing away the truth of what happened that night. Seeing him there, still, silent, half swallowed by shadow, made that fragile, buried truth shake loose again. I squeezed my eyes shut. I told myself it had to be my exhaustion, my guilt, my mind replaying memories in a campground that was too quiet for its own good. But when I opened my eyes again, he was still there. Same posture, same unnatural stillness, his face angled just enough that the lantern light from inside the van brushed the contour of a cheek I swore had once belonged to my closest friend. But what shattered me wasn't seeing him. It was seeing how wrong he looked. His proportions were there. The height, the build, the unmistakable tilt of his shoulders. But something about the outline felt bent, like his body didn't fit the shape it was in anymore. His head was turned too far. His left arm hung at an angle that suggested had been broken and rehealed in a way nature never intended. And the darkness around him felt unnaturally thick, as if the night refused to touch him. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. And yet I could feel him watching me in the same way he had watched me on the ridge that final night before everything went wrong. I backed away from the window on instinct, my body folding in on itself the way it had when I was a kid, and thought hiding made me safer. The van felt too small, too fragile. The walls that usually made me feel protected now felt thin as paper. It didn't help that my mind kept replaying the whispers, the sound of my name spoken in a voice that was Jonah's. Almost. Except there was something else beneath it. A dissonance. A second tone layered under his, like the forest itself was trying to mimic him, but didn't quite understand how human voices worked. I slid into the driver's seat, my hands shaking. I didn't dare look out the windshield at first, afraid I'd see him standing directly in front of the van. I told myself to breathe, to think rationally, to understand that what I was experiencing didn't align with reality. But reality has a way of bending when fear presses against it long enough. I finally forced myself to lift my head. He wasn't in front of the van, but something else was. Just past the tree line, illuminated only by a sliver of moonlight, hung a figure I couldn't identify. Not Jonah. Something taller, too elongated to be human, its limbs branching out into shapes that looked more like roots than arms. It swayed gently as if suspended in the air by something I couldn't see. And every time it swayed, the trees around it seemed to bow, their needles trembling in a way they hadn't when I first arrived. For a moment, all I could think was, this is the thing that brought Jonah back. This is the thing he followed that night, or the thing that followed him. I snapped my attention back to the side window. Jonah, or whatever wore his outline, was gone. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't see movement. One moment he was there, and the next, the space beside the pine was empty, the shadows seeming to swallow the last trace of him. My breath came out in a shallow gasp, and I reached for my keys on instinct. All I wanted was to drive. Even if the van stalled, even if the gravel road twisted, even if the night swallowed the headlights, anything was better than staying, but my keys weren't where I left them. I knew exactly where I'd placed them, right in the cup holder beside the parking brake. I always put them there when I camped because it was easy to reach if I needed to leave fast. Now the space was empty, and something cold trickled down the back of my spine. I scanned the floor, the seats, the cracks between the cushions. Nothing. My mind raced back to the dragging sound, the tapping, the whisper. Had something reached inside when I was too paralyzed to move? Had the sliding door been unlocked? A sharp knock hit the rear window, so sudden and violent that I jolted back in the seat. It wasn't a human knock. It was too forceful, too heavy, like someone had swung a rock against the glass. I scrambled for anything I could use as a weapon, my flashlight, my coffee mug, anything. But the shaking in my hands made everything feel useless. Another knock. Louder. Closer. The third came from the roof. I looked up slowly, almost afraid that if I moved too quickly, it would trigger something worse. The roof of the van creaked beneath shifting weight, a slow, deliberate pressure that traveled from the back toward the front as though something enormous was crawling across the metal. I could hear the subtle groan of the suspension adjusting, the faint whine of the roof panel bending under strain. Then the whisper came again. Not from the door this time, from directly above me. Evan. My name stretched like it had been pulled through a narrow crack, the voice cracking mid-syllable as if something was straining to imitate it. It wasn't Jonah anymore. It wasn't even close. This voice scraped against the inside of my skull like someone dragging a nail across bone. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The whisper wasn't entering through sound. It was sliding beneath it, pressing into me like a memory I couldn't block out. A sudden thump hit the windshield, and I flinched hard enough that my knee slammed into the steering wheel. I looked up and saw a handprint smeared across the glass. Not a human handprint. Too long. Too many joints. The fingers curved inward like hooked branches, the imprint leaving behind streaks of that same metallic residue I'd found in the pine needle piles. The residue glistened under the interior light, dark and almost pulsing. That finally snapped me out of being frozen. I lunged into the back, yanked open the small cabinet where I kept my emergency gear, and pulled out my secondary key. The one I kept taped inside the cabinet for moments exactly like this. I don't know why I never mentioned it to anyone. Maybe part of me always expected danger on the road, expected uncertainty. I'd told myself it was for lockouts or losing my main key. Now it felt like the only smart decision I'd made all night. The roof creaked again, heavier this time, and for a split second I thought the entire van might collapse. I crawled back to the driver's seat, shoved the key into the ignition, and turned it. The engine sputtered. Once, twice. On the third try, it roared to life so loudly the sound echoed off the trees like a warning shot. The pressure on the roof vanished instantly. I didn't wait to see where it went. I threw the van into reverse, gravel spitting under the rear tires, and the moment I cleared the campsite, I slammed it into drive and tore down the road faster than I'd ever driven this van in my life. The pines rushed past in a blur, branches whipping the sides like hands trying to grab hold. My heart hammered so fast I could barely hear the engine. Halfway down the road, I looked in the rearview mirror. What I saw nearly made me jerk the wheel. A figure sprinting after me. Not Jonah. Something taller. Faster. Its limbs bending wrong, like it had too many joints. Like it had borrowed the idea of human movement but hadn't mastered it. Its face, if it had one, was hidden by the dark, but its speed was impossible. No animal in that forest could move like that. No human could cover distance the way it did, its body flickering between the trees as if the shadows themselves helped carry it forward. Then, just before the turn where the road dipped out of sight, it stopped, completely still. And as I watched in the mirror, it slowly lifted one arm and pointed directly at me. I didn't look back again, but even as I sped away, part of me knew I hadn't escaped yet. Because whatever that thing was, whatever wore Jonah's outline like a discarded coat, it hadn't followed me for the thrill. It wanted something I hadn't admitted out loud in 4 years. It wanted the truth. And it wasn't going to stop until I faced it. I kept driving long after the campground disappeared behind me, long after the last faint glow of the moon vanished behind rolling hills and the road straightened into a narrow stretch, cutting through open desert. I didn't ease off the gas until my hands hurt from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still running just outside the reach of my headlights. Not behind me anymore. Beside me. Parallel. Hidden. Patient. I don't know how many miles passed before my pulse finally dipped below panic. But by the time I spotted the turnout near an abandoned ranger station, my vision was swimming and my arms trembled from exhaustion. I pulled over too fast, gravel popping under the tires, and killed the engine. The silence that followed wrapped around the Volkswagen in a way that felt different from Willow Creek. This silence wasn't expectant. It wasn't suffocating. It was empty, like even the land didn't want to remember whatever I'd escaped. I sat there for a long time, my forehead resting on the steering wheel, each breath shaky and shallow. Everything inside me wanted to keep driving until sunrise, until state lines passed under me, until I could pretend none of what happened was real. But pretending was how I ended up here in the first place. Pretending was what kept Jonah's ghost stitched into the corners of my life, haunting places where he didn't belong. When I finally lifted my head, the windows were fogged with my breath. I wiped a clear swipe on the glass and scanned the area. Nothing moved. No shapes in the trees. No taps on metal. No wrong silhouettes waiting just out of sight. Just the abandoned ranger station, a squat concrete structure with a collapsed roof and boarded windows, and an empty road stretching into darkness. But even with the world quiet around me, my heartbeat wouldn't slow the way I needed it to. I wanted to believe I was safe. I wanted to believe that leaving the campground was enough, that the thing wearing Jonah's outline belonged to those woods and not to me. But the truth sat in my chest with a heaviness I couldn't swallow. I knew better. I'd felt it the moment I looked into those dark, unblinking eyes outside the van window. It wasn't bound to Willow Creek. It was bound to me. A sharp ache tightened behind my ribs, the familiar kind that comes from holding on to something too long, pain, guilt, regret. I leaned back against the seat and finally let the memories I'd spent years burying rise to the surface. They came slowly at first, like silt clouding water, then clearer, sharper, until I couldn't pretend anymore. The truth was simple and terrible. Jonah didn't just vanish that night near Sedona. He vanished because of me. I didn't push him. I didn't hurt him. But I ignored him at the moment he needed someone to pull him back. I let his fear sound like paranoia. I let my logic dismiss his instincts. I told him he was imagining things when he swore the forest was whispering to him. And by the time I realized he wasn't imagining anything, it was too late. I could feel the weight of those memories pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat. I opened the glove compartment and pulled out the one thing I'd kept hidden for years, tucked beneath registration papers and old trail maps, the torn page from Jonah's notebook, the page I'd never shown his parents, or the police, or anyone, the page he handed me that night right before he disappeared. I unfolded it slowly, hands shaking. One sentence filled the page in rushed handwriting. If you hear your name from the trees, it's already too late. I stared at the words until they blurred, my pulse thundering in my ears. Jonah wasn't wrong. He hadn't been delusional or panicked or misinterpreting anything. He'd been warning me, begging me to understand what he felt in those woods. The same presence that had whispered my name tonight, wearing his voice like a mask. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. The air shifted, not outside, inside. A soft, unnatural chill threaded through the van, subtle at first, like a draft moving across my ankles. I froze. My eyes snapped open. The windows were up. The doors were locked. The van was airtight except for the vents. But the cold didn't move like air. It moved like awareness. I looked around slowly, dread filling the hollow parts of my lungs. At first, nothing seemed different. The cabinets were closed. My sleeping bag was where I left it. My lantern sat on the counter, still switched off. Then I saw it. Condensation, a small patch of it forming on the inside of the rear window. Not from my breathing, I was holding my breath without realizing it. No, this condensation was spreading in a circle, like someone was pressing their face against the glass from the outside. But the imprint was forming from within. I slid down in my seat instinctively as the moisture thickened, blooming outward into the shape of a face. Not a full face. There was no nose, no mouth, just the unmistakable outline of eye sockets, empty, wide, watching. The chill deepened, crawling up my spine like cold fingers. I reached slowly for the ignition key, still tucked into the slot. Before I could turn it, a whisper curled up from directly behind me. Not from the roof, not from the window, from inside the van. Evan, my entire body locked. The whisper wasn't Jonah's anymore. It wasn't the forest's imitation. It was something older, something cracked and hollow, like a voice that had never been meant to speak through a human mouth. I didn't turn around. Every instinct in me screamed not to. But something shifted in the back of the van, fabric brushing against metal. A soft thump. A slow, dragging sound, like someone or something was pulling itself forward inch by inch from the rear compartment toward the driver's seat. The voice stretched again, thinner this time, fraying at the edges like it didn't know how much pressure a human mind could handle. My hands shook violently as I twisted the ignition. The engine turned over, but the moment the van vibrated, something behind me knocked once against the metal panel of the interior. Hard enough that I felt it in my bones. I slammed the transmission into drive. A cold hand, no, not a hand, something shaped like one but jointed wrong, clamped onto the back of my seat. I screamed without sound, adrenaline overwhelming my voice. The van lurched forward onto the road, gravel spitting out behind the tires. The gripping pressure tightened for one horrifying second, then slipped away as the van gained speed. I didn't look into the rearview mirror. I couldn't. If I saw it, if I saw what was crawling toward me, I knew something inside me would break. I kept my foot on the gas, knuckles white, breath ragged, until the van hit a stretch of smooth pavement and the speedometer climbed past 60. Only then did I finally risk a glance into the mirror. The rear of the van was empty, but the condensation face was still on the window. And now a single line had been drawn through it, from top to bottom, like a finger had slowly dragged through the moisture. A mark, a message, a reminder. Whatever I left behind in Willow Creek had followed me. And whatever followed me wasn't finished yet. I drove through the night with a single thought rising like a warning drum in my chest. You can't outrun what you refuse to face. And I knew, somewhere deep beneath the fear, that until I confronted what happened to Jonah, until I spoke the truth aloud, that thing would keep crawling toward me. It would whisper, it would mimic, it would tap, and eventually it would stop pretending. I had to go back. But going back meant admitting something I'd never dared to say. Going back meant telling the truth about the night Jonah died, and the truth wasn't just ugly, it was waiting for me. I remember the first time I drove my old Volkswagen west toward Hollow Creek, the way the tires hummed against the asphalt, how the setting sun painted the forest edges gold, and how every mile seemed to stretch both time and expectation. I had picked the van up at a tiny dealership in Portland, scratched, dented, a little stubborn with the brakes, but it had character. The salesman, a wiry man with a cigarette tucked under his lip, had said, "She's got stories to tell if you listen." I hadn't thought much of it then. I never thought listening would mean the kind of quiet, persistent whispers that could creep into your mind when no one else is around. Hollow Creek looked innocent enough from the road. A thin ribbon of water, shaded by cottonwoods and pines running quietly through the valley. The campground was small, barely marked, but the map said it had spots for overnight stays, and that was all I needed. I pulled into a shaded clearing, the Volkswagen groaning under its own weight as I parked. I stepped out and let the cool evening air roll over me, smelling the creek water and pine needles, feeling the soft bite of damp moss under my boots. There was something calming about it, something that almost made me forget the strange feeling that had begun the moment I turned onto the dirt access road. The first night was easy. I made a fire in the pit nearest the van, brewed instant coffee, and sat listening to the water gurgle over stones. The wind whispered through the trees like a memory you can almost touch but can't quite hold. That's when I first heard it, a faint tapping sound against the side of the Volkswagen. I froze, listening. A branch? An animal? I circled the van, but nothing. The shadows shifted like they had a will of their own, and I told myself I was imagining it. By morning, the unease had settled into the air itself. The van, which had felt like a companion the night before, now carried a subtle tension, a quiet hum, almost as if it had absorbed the creek's darkness while I slept. I packed my small bag, intending to hike the nearby trail before breakfast, but when I swung open the driver's door, the tap was back, lighter, almost playful, against the roof. I shook it off again. It wasn't until the third night, that the van's history revealed itself. I had parked closer to the creek this time, letting the water's light lap against my campsite, reflecting pale streaks inside the windshield. I was curled up in the back, listening to a podcast when I heard it. The van's hatch rattling from the inside, slow and deliberate. I froze mid-breath. That hatch didn't move unless I touched it, unless someone was inside. But no one was. The only sound in the clearing was the water and my own heartbeat thumping loud enough that I could feel it in my fingertips. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The beam fell over the Volkswagen, landing on its familiar dents, the chipped green paint, the bumper sticker that had faded from countless suns. Then the hatch rattled again. Not hard, almost like a tap, like someone was knocking from the inside to say, "Look closer." I tried rationalizing. Maybe an animal, maybe a trick of the wind. But the air was still. And then I saw it. The faint imprint of a hand on the inside of the rear hatch window. Not on the glass itself, I could see my reflection, clear and uninterrupted, but somehow within the faint tint of the van's interior, a shape pressed outward. Slowly, deliberately. I stumbled back, tripping over a rock. The imprint lingered, even as I shone my light directly into the hatch, my stomach clenched in a way I hadn't felt since childhood nightmares. I spent the rest of that night sitting on the hood, knees to chest, watching the shadows twist and stretch across the creek. I tried talking to myself, tried reasoning that it was residue, a trick of condensation, but the voice in my head wouldn't stop whispering. Not words, not sentences, just a feeling. A presence, something trying to push itself out of the steel shell that had carried it here decades ago. By the next morning, I found a notebook tucked under the driver's seat. I had not put it there. It was a small, leather-bound thing, worn and smelling faintly of creek water and gasoline. The pages were blank except for a single sentence, written in a hand I did not recognize. "I'm still here." My hands shook. I scanned the van for cameras, microphones, hidden pranks. Nothing. And yet the words burned into me, anchoring a fear that refused to leave. The following day, I met a local, a man named Caleb, who was thinning the brush along the far side of the creek. He had a slow, wary way of speaking, eyes like river stones, smooth but alert. I mentioned the van. He froze for a moment, staring at me as if weighing what he could say. Finally, he said, "Hollow Creek has history. That van you drive, it's older than you think. People say it keeps what it sees, keeps what it loses. Never touch the water while inside, or it'll try to give it back." I laughed nervously, but the corners of his mouth didn't move. The creek shimmered behind him, pale and unreadable. Something about the way he said it made me feel smaller, exposed, as if I had wandered into the last chapter of a story I didn't understand. That evening, I parked the Volkswagen farther from the creek, near the older pines where the wind made the needles rattle like dry bones. I tried to sleep, tried to convince myself that notebooks and whispers and handprints were tricks, stories to scare city folk away from the quiet of the forest. But I woke to the sound of the hatch clicking open on its own. Inside, the imprint of a hand pressed against the rear window again. And this time, beneath it, faint words scratched into the condensation. "Give it back." I didn't know what it was. My first instinct was to leave, to abandon the van right there and walk back to the highway. But part of me, stubborn, reckless, foolish, felt tethered, as if the Volkswagen itself had claimed me. I slid into the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, heart hammering. The dashboard lights flickered. The rearview mirror reflected not me, but a shadowed figure hunched over the hatch. It didn't move away when I blinked. It didn't disappear when I looked closer. I drove anyway, through winding roads that seemed to stretch longer than the map suggested. The van rattled beneath me, as if something inside it was shifting, pacing, impatient. I reached a clearing and stopped, too afraid to go on but unwilling to turn back. That's when I noticed the rearview mirror wasn't reflecting the road behind me anymore. Instead, I saw the forest behind Hollow Creek, dense and dark, and the shadow of someone running along the water's edge. Impossibly fast, impossibly silent. And then the van door opened on its own while I was driving, just a crack. I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder. A whisper, rasping and close, said, "I waited." I slammed on the brakes. The Volkswagen skidded to a stop in a patch of gravel, tires grinding, my body shaking, adrenaline ripping through every nerve. The air smelled of wet metal and old pine. The door was closed, the handprint gone, the shadow vanished. But I knew it had been there. It had always been there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the van, knees drawn up, listening to the creek sing like it was alive, as if it understood the presence I had awakened. And I realized then that the van wasn't haunted in the way most people imagine. It wasn't just carrying ghosts. It carried memory, intent, and desire. And whatever had waited decades within that green shell had found me. By sunrise, I felt the weight of the Volkswagen differently. Not just a vehicle, not just a companion, but a vessel that refused to forget. And the question lingered, not if it would act again, but when. I opened the driver's side door and let the morning air wash over me. There was calm in the breeze, yet every shadow seemed to twitch with the memory of the night. I ran my fingers over the steering wheel, noticing how the green paint had dulled in some spots, polished in others, as if hands from another time had left invisible marks. I didn't know what it wanted from me yet, but I had a feeling deep in my chest that Hollow Creek had been waiting to give something back, something I hadn't known I had lost or didn't realize I needed to fear. The days that followed blurred together in an uneasy rhythm. Every morning I convinced myself I could leave Hollow Creek, could drive away and shake whatever presence lingered in the Volkswagen. But each attempt ended the same way. The engine would cough, the tires would stick as if gripping the gravel, and the rearview mirror would reflect not the road, but the creek itself. Always the creek. Pale water stretching impossibly wide, bending light in ways that didn't belong. I tried reasoning with it. I spoke to the van as if it were a person. "I don't know what you want," I said aloud one morning, voice trembling, hands pressed to the steering wheel. "I don't know what I've taken from you." Silence answered, and for a moment I believed the van was listening. Then faint scratches began along the rear hatch, soft at first, like nails over wood, then growing louder, deliberate. My heart pounded as I tried to lift the hatch. Locked. I had not locked it. By nightfall, the forest itself seemed complicit, shadows bent at odd angles beneath the pines, and the creek whispered my name in patterns I could barely recognize. It wasn't malicious, not exactly, but it pressed against me, shaping the air, the van, and even my thoughts. I stayed inside, listening to the water, the taps on the van, the scratch of fingernails that could not be mine. And when I finally did sleep, it was dreamless, or perhaps the dreams were the van, speaking in a language I could not understand. Then one evening, I found the notebook again. It had moved from under the driver's seat to the passenger side, open on the dashboard. This time, the pages were full, filled in a hurried, looping script I could not read easily. I traced the letters with my finger, and a cold pulse ran through me. These weren't ordinary words. They were directions, instructions, warnings. Do not let the water see you. Do not look behind. Give it back, or it will come. I thought of Caleb, of his slow eyes and Riverstone voice. Never touch the water while inside, or it'll try to give it back. My stomach turned. Was it literal? Was the van trying to protect me or to trap me? I dared not ask aloud. The van seemed to respond to sound as if it could listen beyond the physical. I parked by the creek that night anyway, against better judgment. Something drew me to it, a gravity I could not explain. I leaned out of the open door, letting the night air fill my lungs, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The water shimmered, silver in moonlight, and then I saw it. A shape moving just beneath the surface. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something writhing and slow, its form reflecting and refracting like the van itself was mirrored in the creek. The van door rattled behind me, insistent, almost demanding. I stepped back, heart hammering, sweat chilling on my neck. Then the whisper came from inside the van, faint but clear. "Give it back." I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what had been taken or when. but instinct screamed that it had to be returned. I reached toward the water, and the creek's surface shimmered, rising in impossible waves as though it had a mind of its own. My reflection twisted in the van's window, and for a terrifying moment, it was not my face staring back, but a hollow-eyed version of someone, or something, I could not name. I stumbled backward, and the van door slammed shut on its own. The engine roared to life, tires spinning against the gravel, and the rearview mirror reflected a figure moving across the water, arms outstretched, shadowed and desperate. It was waiting, and I realized then that the Volkswagen had been its vessel all along. Not the van itself, not the metal or paint, but the presence inhabiting it, carried across time, tethered to me now by some unseen chain. Sleep became impossible. The van hummed at night, a low vibration that pulsed through the floorboards in my chest. Whispers circled the interior, words I couldn't fully understand but could feel. Longing, warning, insistence. And every morning I found more signs. Scratches along the dashboard, condensation messages on the windows, the notebook moving as if by an unseen hand. I tried leaving. I packed my bag, turned the key, and drove. The tires gripped the road, but then began slipping, as if the asphalt had melted into water beneath me. The rearview mirror showed Hollow Creek stretching wider than possible, the shadows of its trees bleeding into the road. I slammed on the brakes. The van stopped, but the air had changed. It smelled of wet metal, river mud, and something else. Old decay, something that had been waiting in the van for decades. By the third night, I accepted it. I could not leave. The Volkswagen had chosen me. Hollow Creek had chosen me. And the presence inside the van was patient but relentless. I began to understand that the van didn't just carry what it saw. It carried what it remembered. And now I was a part of that memory, a new layer pressed into the contours of its body, whispering in the dark, waiting for the next soul who thought they could drive away from the past. I found myself talking to it, soft words in the dark. "What do you want?" I asked, voice trembling. "Why me?" The hatch rattled, the water shimmered in reply, and the notebook opened to a page I hadn't seen before. A single word, written in a hand both familiar and unknown. Complete. And then I knew. The van didn't just remember. It demanded return. It demanded completion. Something had been taken from Hollow Creek. Something that needed to be given back. Through me. With me. I felt my own reflection in the window twist again. A hollow-eyed mirror. Not quite me. Not quite something older, waiting for release. I reached out, trembling, toward the creek. The water pulsed beneath my hand like it was breathing. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The Volkswagen had always been more than a vehicle. It was a bridge, a vessel, a collector of loss and memory. And now it was mine to navigate. I dipped my hands into the creek, and the water was colder than anything I had ever felt, sharp and alive, pulling at my skin like it remembered every scar I had carried. The Volkswagen's engine thrummed behind me, low and insistent, and I could feel the presence pressing from inside, urging, guiding, almost pleading. I understood then that this was not simply a haunting. It was unfinished business, a transfer of something ancient, something patient, that had waited decades for someone foolish enough to answer its call. The notebook slipped from the dashboard onto the seat beside me, pages flipping open in the breeze, though the air was still. The words on the page swirled, forming shapes in my mind rather than letters. Give it back. Give it back. I looked at the van again and realized it wasn't just metal. It wasn't just tires and paint. It was the container, the anchor. And I was the bridge. I hesitated, letting the cold water lap against my arms, shivering, body tense. I could feel the shadows of Hollow Creek stretching toward me, the reflection of the moon fractured in ripples that shimmered like faces, like hands reaching up. One hand, pale and damp, pressed against the side of the van, leaving a smear that glowed faintly in the moonlight. And then I heard it again, the whisper, soft, almost intimate. Complete it. Complete it. Give it back. My mind raced. What had been taken? What had I stolen unknowingly by driving this van here? The presence pulsed through the van's floorboards, and I could feel a tug at my chest, a longing I could not resist. I gritted my teeth and lowered my hands deeper into the creek, letting the cold bite past my wrists. The van shivered behind me, as if sensing my compliance, its lights flickering in sync with my heartbeat. Then it came, not a figure, not a shape, but a surge, a memory that I felt rather than saw. Faces, people I didn't know, trapped inside the metal of the Volkswagen, their eyes pressed against the windows, mouths opening in silent screams that rippled into the air, into my skin, into my soul. The water rippled violently, and I realized with a sick twist that the van had carried them here, across decades and states, waiting for someone like me to set them free. I pulled back, nearly collapsing, fear tearing through every nerve. The whispers grew louder, layering over each other until I could not distinguish my own thoughts. And then, as if the van itself exhaled, the rear hatch popped open slowly, revealing a pale, shadowed hand. Not human, but tangible, pressing outward, gesturing toward the creek. I stepped closer, despite my terror. The water licked at my knees, and the hand reached toward me again, urging, guiding. The whispers became coherent, a single voice rising above the chaos. Give it back. My trembling fingers closed around the hand, not with force, but with acceptance. And in that instant, I understood. I had to return what had been taken, not mine, but carried, stored, trapped in the van's body. The creek roared in response, suddenly alive, pulling at my hands, my arms, my chest, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. I felt the presence inside the Volkswagen shift, condense, and move. A rush of cold air and wet shadow, circling me, tugging me toward the water. I barely had time to brace myself before it happened. A surge of energy, a pulse that threw me backward, soaking my clothes, chilling me to the bone, and then silence. The water stilled. The van sat quiet, no longer humming, no longer vibrating. I stared at it, chest heaving, drenched, hair plastered to my forehead. The notebook lay open on the dashboard, pages blank again. The handprints were gone. The whispers had stopped. And for the first time in days, the rearview mirror reflected only me, only the forest, only the creek. I collapsed beside the van, shivering, soaked, and trying to breathe through the adrenaline still hammering in my veins. The moonlight danced on the water, calm now, unbroken, as though it had never been alive at all. And yet, deep inside, I knew what had happened. I had completed something. I had given back whatever it was the Volkswagen had carried across decades. Something restless, something patient, something old and cunning. Morning came slowly. The air was crisp, scented with pine and the faint tang of the creek. I sat on the hood of the Volkswagen, watching the water, half expecting another handprint, another whisper, another sign that the presence remained. But there was nothing, only the gentle rush of the creek, the wind through the pines, and the faint hum of an old van resting in quiet solitude. I knew then that Hollow Creek had a memory and that the Volkswagen had been the vessel. It had waited for someone willing to listen, to obey, to understand without questioning too much. And in returning what had been taken, I had become part of the story, a witness, a participant, a survivor. I drove away that morning, the tires crunching on the gravel, but not without reverence. The van felt lighter somehow, freed of something I could not name. And I felt different too, more aware, more fragile, more alive in the face of the incomprehensible. I didn't speak. I didn't look back. The creek was behind me, silent now, its surface smooth, reflecting nothing but sky. Weeks later, I found myself retelling the story to friends, careful to avoid exaggeration, careful not to provoke disbelief. And yet, even as I spoke, I felt the van's presence in the periphery of my thoughts. Patient, persistent, not threatening anymore, but insistent. A reminder that memory lingers, that what we carry can have a will of its own, and that sometimes the only way to survive is to listen, to obey, to complete the unfinished. Hollow Creek faded into the distance, the road stretching long and empty ahead. I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time before the forest disappeared completely. The reflection showed only me, wet and tired, gripping the wheel of an old Volkswagen. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the van remembered. It always would. There is power in listening, in patience, in acknowledging what waits for you, even when it terrifies. Hollow Creek and that Volkswagen had taught me that. Fear is not always the enemy. Sometimes it is the guide. Sometimes it is the doorway to understanding, to survival, to becoming something more than what you were before. I had driven into Hollow Creek looking for solitude, for adventure, for the quiet thrill of a weekend away. I left with a story, yes, but also with a reckoning, the kind that marks you, reshapes you, binds you in ways you do not fully comprehend. The van hummed softly as I drove, green paint catching the morning sun, its dents and scratches holding secrets it would never reveal completely. And for the first time I understood. The past is never truly gone, and some vehicles carry more than just people. They carry memory. They carry intent. They carry the waiting. And if you are brave enough or foolish enough to listen, sometimes they will return what you never knew you had lost, shaping your path forever.